Dedication to W. P. Kerr. If the professor of poetry in the University of Oxford has not forgotten the rock whence he was hewn, this simple story may give him an hour of entertainment. I offer it to you because I think you have met my friend Dickson McCunn, and I dare to hope that you may even in your many sojournings in the Westlands have encountered one or other of the Gorbals' diehards. If you share my kindly feeling for Dickson, you will be interested in some facts which I have lately ascertained about his ancestry. In his veins there flows a portion of the redoubtable blood of the Nicol Jovis. When the Bailey, you remember, returned from his journey to Rob Roy beyond the Highland line, he espoused his housekeeper Mattie, an honest man's daughter and a near cousin o' the Laird o' Limmerfield. The union was blessed with a son, who succeeded to the Bailey's business and in due course begat daughters, one of whom married a certain Ebenezer McCunn, of whom there is record in the archives of the Hammer Men of Glasgow. Ebenezer's grandson, Peter by name, was provost of Kirkintilloch, and his second son was the father of my hero by his marriage with Robina Dickson, eldest daughter of one Robert Dickson, a tenant farmer in the Lennox. So there are coloured threads in Mr. McCunn's pedigree, and, like the Bailey, he can count kin, should he wish, with Rob Roy himself through the old wife ayont the fire at Stuckavrallachan. Such as it is, I dedicate to you the story, and ask for no better verdict on it than that of that profound critic of life and literature, Mr. Huckleberry Finn, who observed of the Pilgrim's Progress that he considered the statements interesting, but steep. J.B. Prologue. The girl came into the room with a darting movement like a swallow, looked round her with the same bird-like quickness, and then ran across the polished floor to where a young man sat on a sofa with one leg laid along it. "I have saved you this dance, Quentin," she said, pronouncing the name with a pretty staccato. "You must be so lonely not dancing, so I will sit with you. What shall we talk about?" The young man did not answer at once, for his gaze was held by her face. He had never dreamed that the gawky and rather plain little girl whom he had romped with long ago in Paris would grow into such a being. The clean delicate lines of her figure, the exquisite pure colouring of hair and skin, the charming young arrogance of the eyes, this was beauty, he reflected, a miracle, a revelation. Her virginal fineness and her dress, which was the tint of pale fire, gave her the air of a creature of ice and flame. "About yourself, please, Saskia," he said. "Are you happy now that you are a grown-up lady?" Happy. Her voice had a thrill in it like music, frosty music. "The days are far too short. I grudge the hours when I must sleep. They say it is sad for me to make my debut in a time of war. But the world is very kind to me, and after all it is a victorious war for our Russia. And listen to this, Quentin. Tomorrow I am to be allowed to begin nursing at the Alexander Hospital. What do you think of that?" The time was January, 1916, and the place a room in the great Niski Palace. No hint of war, no breath from the snowy streets, entered that curious chamber where Prince Peter Niski kept some of the chief of his famous treasures. It was notable for its lack of drapery and upholstering, only a sofa or two and a few fine rugs on the cedar floor. The walls were of a green marble veined like malachite, the ceiling was of darker marble inlaid with white intaglios. Scattered everywhere were tables and cabinets laden with Celadon china, and carved jade, and ivories, and shimmering Persian and Rhodian vessels. In all the room there was scarcely anything of metal and no touch of gilding or bright color. The light came from green alabaster censers, and the place swam in a cold green radiance like some cavern below the sea. The air was warm and scented, and though it was very quiet there, a hum of voices and the strains of dance music drifted to it from the pillared corridor in which could be seen the glare of lights from the great ballroom beyond. The young man had a thin face with lines of suffering round the mouth and eyes. The warm room had given him a high color, which increased his air of fragility. He felt a little choked by the place, which seemed to him for both body and mind a hot house, though he knew very well that the Niski Palace on this gala evening was in no way typical of the land or its masters. Only a week ago he had been eating black bread with its owner in a hut on the Volhinian front. "You have become amazing, Saskia," he said. "I won't pay my old playfellow compliments, besides, you must be tired of them. I wish you happiness all the day long like a fairy tale princess. But a crock like me can't do much to help you to it. The service seems to be the wrong way round, for here you are wasting your time talking to me." She put her hand on his. "Poor Quentin. Is the leg very bad?" He laughed. "Oh, no. It's mending famously. I'll be able to get about without a stick in another month, and then you've got to teach me all the new dances." The jigging music of a two-step floated down the corridor. It made the young man's brow contract, for it brought to him a vision of dead faces in the gloom of a November dusk. He had once had a friend who used to whistle that air, and he had seen him die in the Hollabeek mud. There was something macabre in the tune. He was surely morbid this evening, for there seemed something macabre about the house, the room, the dancing, all Russia. These last days he had suffered from a sense of calamity impending, of a dark curtain drawing down upon a splendid world. They didn't agree with him at the embassy, but he could not get rid of the notion. The girl saw his sudden abstraction. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. It had been her favorite question as a child. "I was thinking that I rather wished you were still in Paris." "But why?" "Because I think you would be safer." "Oh, what nonsense, Quentin dear. Where should I be safe if not in my own Russia, where I have friends, oh, so many, and tribes of relations? It is France and England that are unsafe with the German guns grumbling at their doors. My complaint is that my life is too corseted and padded. I am too secure, and I do not want to be secure." The young man lifted a heavy casket from a table at his elbow. It was of dark green imperial jade, with a wonderfully carved lid. He took off the lid and picked up 3 small oddments of ivory, a priest with a beard, a tiny soldier and a draught box. Putting the 3 in a triangle, he balanced the jade box on them. "Look, Saskia. If you were living inside that box you would think it very secure. You would note the thickness of the walls and the hardness of the stone, and you would dream away in a peaceful green dusk. But all the time it would be held up by trifles, brittle trifles." She shook her head. "You do not understand. You cannot understand. We are a very old and strong people with roots deep, deep in the earth." "Please God you are right," he said. "But, Saskia, you know that if I can ever serve you, you have only to command me. Now I can do no more for you than the mouse for the lion at the beginning of the story. But the story had an end, you remember, and someday it may be in my power to help you. Promise to send for me." The girl laughed merrily. "The King of Spain's daughter," she quoted, "came to visit me. And all for the love of my little nut tree." The other laughed also, as a young man in the uniform of the Preobrazhensky Guard approached to claim the girl. "Even a nut tree may be a shelter in a storm," he said. "Of course I promise, Quentin," she said. "Au revoir. Soon I will come and take you to supper, and we will talk of nothing but nut trees." He watched the 2 leave the room, her gown glowing like a tongue of fire in the shadowy archway. Then he slowly rose to his feet, for he thought that for a little he would watch the dancing. Something moved beside him, and he turned in time to prevent the jade casket from crashing to the floor. 2 of the supports had slipped. He replaced the thing on its proper table and stood silent for a moment. The priest and the soldier gone, and only the beast of burden left. If I were inclined to be superstitious, I should call that a dashed bad omen. Chapter 1. How a retired provision merchant felt the impulse of spring. Mr. Dickson McCunn completed the polishing of his smooth cheeks with the towel, glanced appreciatively at their reflection in the looking glass, and then permitted his eyes to stray out of the window. In the little garden lilacs were budding, and there was a gold line of daffodils beside the tiny greenhouse. Beyond the city wall a birch flaunted its new tassels, and the jackdaws were circling about the steeple of the Guthrie Memorial Kirk. A blackbird whistled from a thorn bush, and Mr. McCunn was inspired to follow its example. He began a tolerable version of Roy's Wife of Aldivalloch. He felt singularly light-hearted, and the immediate cause was his safety razor. A week ago he had bought the thing in a sudden fit of enterprise, and now he shaved in 5 minutes, where before he had taken 20, and no longer confronted his fellows, at least one day in 3, with a countenance ludicrously mottled by sticking plaster. Calculation revealed to him the fact that in his 55 years, having begun to shave at 18, he had wasted 3,370 hours, or 140 days, or between 4 and 5 months, by his neglect of this admirable invention. Now he felt that he had stolen a march on time. He had fallen heir, thus late, to a fortune in unpurchasable leisure. He began to dress himself in the sombre clothes in which he had been accustomed for 35 years and more to go down to the shop in Mearn Street. And then a thought came to him which made him discard the grey, striped trousers, sit down on the edge of his bed, and muse. Since Saturday the shop was a thing of the past. On Saturday at 11:30, to the accompaniment of a glass of dubious sherry, he had completed the arrangements by which the provision shop in Mearn Street, which had borne so long the legend of D. McCunn, together with the branches in Crossmaloof and the Shores, became the property of a company, yclept the United Supply Stores, Limited. He had received in payment cash, debentures and preference shares, and his lawyers and his own acumen had acclaimed the bargain. But all the week end he had been a little sad. It was the end of so old a song, and he knew no other tune to sing. He was comfortably off, healthy, free from any particular cares in life, but free too from any particular duties. Will I be going to turn into a useless old man? He asked himself. But he had woke up this Monday to the sound of the blackbird, and the world, which had seemed rather empty 12 hours before, was now brisk and alluring. His prowess in quick shaving assured him of his youth. "I'm no that dead old," he observed, as he sat on the edge of the bed, to his reflection in the big-looking glass. It was not an old face. The sandy hair was a little thin on the top and a little grey at the temples, the figure was perhaps a little too full for youthful elegance, and an athlete would have censured the neck as too fleshy for perfect health. But the cheeks were rosy, the skin clear, and the pale eyes singularly childlike. They were a little weak, those eyes, and had some difficulty in looking for long at the same object, so that Mr. McCunn did not stare people in the face, and had, in consequence, at one time in his career acquired a perfectly undeserved reputation for cunning. He shaved clean, and looked uncommonly like a wise, plump schoolboy. As he gazed at his simulacrum he stopped whistling Roy's Wife and let his countenance harden into a noble sternness. Then he laughed, and observed in the language of his youth that there was life in the old dowg yet. In that moment the soul of Mr. McCunn conceived the great plan. The first sign of it was that he swept all his business garments unceremoniously onto the floor. The next that he rootled at the bottom of a deep drawer and extracted a most disreputable tweed suit. It had once been what I believe is called a Lovat mixture, but was now a nondescript sub-fusk, with bright patches of colour like moss on whinstone. He regarded it lovingly, for it had been for 20 years his holiday wear, emerging annually for a hallowed month to be stained with salt and bleached with sun. He put it on, and stood shrouded in an odour of camphor. A pair of thick-nailed boots and a flannel shirt and collar completed the equipment of the sportsman. He had another long look at himself in the glass, and then descended whistling to breakfast. This time the tune was McGregor's Gathering, and the sound of it stirred the grimy lips of a man outside who was delivering coals, himself a McGregor, to follow suit. Mr. McCunn was a very fountain of music that morning. Tibby, the aged maid, had his newspaper and letters waiting by his plate, and a dish of ham and eggs frizzling near the fire. He fell to ravenously but still musingly, and he had reached the stage of scones and jam before he glanced at his correspondence. There was a letter from his wife now holidaying at the Nuke Hydropathic. She reported that her health was improving, and that she had met various people who had known somebody who had known somebody else whom she had once known herself. Mr. McCunn read the dutiful pages and smiled. "Mamma's enjoying herself fine," he observed to the teapot. He knew that for his wife the earthly paradise was a hydropathic, where she put on her afternoon dress and every jewel she possessed when she rose in the morning, ate large meals of which the novelty atoned for the nastiness, and collected an immense casual acquaintance with whom she discussed ailments, ministers, sudden deaths, and the intricate genealogies of her class. For his part he rancorously hated hydropathics, having once spent a black week under the roof of one in his wife's company. He detested the food, the Turkish baths, he had a passionate aversion to baring his body before strangers, the inability to find anything to do and the compulsion to endless small talk. A thought flitted over his mind which he was too loyal to formulate. Once he and his wife had had similar likings, but they had taken different roads since their child died. Janet. He saw again, he was never quite free from the sight, the solemn little white-frocked girl who had died long ago in the spring. It may have been the thought of the Nuke Hydropathic, or more likely the thin clean scent of the daffodils with which Tibby had decked the table, but long ere breakfast was finished the great plan had ceased to be an airy vision and become a sober well-masoned structure. Mr. McCunn, I may confess it at the start, was an incurable romantic. He had had a humdrum life since the day when he had first entered his uncle's shop with the hope of someday succeeding that honest grocer, and his feet had never strayed a yard from his sober rut. But his mind, like the dying gladiator's, had been far away. As a boy he had voyaged among books, and they had given him a world where he could shape his career according to his whimsical fancy. Not that Mr. McCunn was what is known as a great reader. He read slowly and fastidiously, and sought in literature for one thing alone. Sir Walter Scott had been his first guide, but he read the novels not for their insight into human character or for their historical pageantry, but because they gave him material wherewith to construct fantastic journeys. It was the same with Dickens. A lit tavern, a stage coach, post horses, the clack of hoofs on a frosty road, went to his head like wine. He was a Jacobite not because he had any views on divine right, but because he had always before his eyes a picture of a knot of adventurers in cloaks, new landed from France, among the western heather. On this select basis he had built up his small library, Defoe, Hazlitt, and the essayists, Boswell, some indifferent romances and a shelf of spirited poetry. His tastes became known, and he acquired a reputation for a scholarly habit. He was president of the Literary Society of the Guthrie Memorial Kirk, and read to its members a variety of papers full of a gusto which rarely became critical. He had been 3 times chairman at Burns' anniversary dinners, and had delivered orations in eulogy of the national bard, not because he greatly admired him, he thought him rather vulgar, but because he took Burns as an emblem of the Burns-like literature which he loved. Mr. McCunn was no scholar and was sublimely unconscious of background. He grew his flowers in his small garden plot oblivious of their origins so long as they gave him the color and scent he sought. Scent, I say, for he appreciated more than the mere picturesque. He had a passion for words and cadences, and would be haunted for weeks by a cunning phrase, savoring it as a connoisseur savors a vintage. Wherefore long ago, when he could ill afford it, he had purchased the Edinburgh Stevenson. They were the only large books on his shelves, for he had a liking for small volumes, things he could stuff into his pocket in that sudden journey which he loved to contemplate. Only he had never taken it. The shop had tied him up for 11 months in the year, and the 12th had always found him settled decorously with his wife in some seaside villa. He had not fretted, for he was content with dreams. He was always a little tired, too, when the holidays came, and his wife told him he was growing old. He consoled himself with tags from the more philosophic of his authors, but he scarcely needed consolation. For he had large stores of modest contentment. But now something had happened. A spring morning and a safety razor had convinced him that he was still young. Since yesterday he was a man of a large leisure. Providence had done for him what he would never have done for himself. The rut in which he had travelled so long had given place to open country. He repeated to himself one of the quotations with which he had been wont to stir the literary young men at the Guthrie Memorial Kirk. "What's a man's age? He must hurry more, that's all. Cram in a day, what his youth took a year to hold. When we mind labour, then only, we're too old." What age had Methuselah when he begat Saul? He would go journeying, who but he, pleasantly. It sounds a trivial resolve, but it quickened Mr. McCunn to the depths of his being. A holiday, and alone. On foot, of course, for he must travel light. He would buckle on a pack after the approved fashion. He had the very thing in a drawer upstairs, which he had bought some years ago at a sale. That and a waterproof and a stick, and his outfit was complete. A book, too, and, as he lit his first pipe, he considered what it should be. Poetry, clearly, for it was the spring, and besides poetry could be got in pleasantly small bulk. He stood before his bookshelves trying to select a volume, rejecting one after another as inapposite. Browning, Keats, Shelley, they seemed more suited for the hearth than for the roadside. He did not want anything Scots, for he was of opinion that spring came more richly in England and that English people had a better notion of it. He was tempted by the Oxford Anthology, but was deterred by its thickness, for he did not possess the thin, paper edition. Finally he selected Isaac Walton. He had never fished in his life, but The Complete Angler seemed to fit his mood. It was old and curious and learned and fragrant with the youth of things. He remembered its falling cadences, its country songs and wise meditations. Decidedly it was the right script for his pilgrimage. Characteristically he thought last of where he was to go. Every bit of the world beyond his front door had its charms to the seeing eye. There seemed nothing common or unclean that fresh morning. Even a walk among coal pits had its attractions. But since he had the right to choose, he lingered over it like an epicure. Not the Highlands, for spring came late among their sour mosses. Some place where there were fields and woods and inns, somewhere, too, within call of the sea. It must not be too remote, for he had no time to waste on train journeys, nor too near, for he wanted a countryside untainted. Presently he thought of Carrick. A good green land, as he remembered it, with purposeful white roads and public houses sacred to the memory of Burns, near the hills but yet lowland, and with a bright sea chafing on its shores. He decided on Carrick, found a map and planned his journey. Then he routed out his knapsack, packed it with a modest change of raiment, and sent out Tibby to buy chocolate and tobacco and to cash a cheque at the Strathclyde Bank. Till Tibby returned he occupied himself with delicious dreams. He saw himself daily growing browner and leaner, swinging along broad highways or wandering in bypaths. He pictured his seasons of ease, when he unslung his pack and smoked in some clump of lilacs by a burnside. He remembered a phrase of Stevenson's somewhat like that. He would meet and talk with all sorts of folk, an exhilarating prospect, for Mr. McCunn loved his kind. There would be the evening hour before he reached his inn, when, pleasantly tired, he would top some ridge and see the welcoming lights of a little town. There would be the lamp lit after supper time when he would read and reflect, and the start in the gay morning, when tobacco tastes sweetest and even 55 seems young. It would be holiday of the purest, for no business now tugged at his coat tails. He was beginning a new life, he told himself, when he could cultivate the seedling interests which had withered beneath the far-reaching shade of the shop. Was ever a man more fortunate or more free? Tibby was told that he was going off for a week or two. No letters need be forwarded, for he would be constantly moving, but Mrs. McCunn at the Nuke Hydropathic would be kept informed of his whereabouts. Presently he stood on his doorstep, a stocky figure in ancient tweeds, with a bulging pack slung on his arm, and a stout hazel stick in his hand. A passer-by would have remarked an elderly shopkeeper bent apparently on a day in the country, a common little man on a prosaic errand. But the passer-by would have been wrong, for he could not see into the heart. The plump citizen was the eternal pilgrim. He was Jason, Ulysses, Eric the Red, Albuquerque, Cortez, starting out to discover new worlds. Before he left, Mr. McCunn had given Tibby a letter to post. That morning he had received an epistle from a benevolent acquaintance, one Mackintosh, regarding a group of urchins who called themselves the Gorbals Diehards. Behind the premises in Mern Street lay a tract of slums, full of mischievous boys with whom his staff waged truceless war. But lately there had started among them a kind of unauthorized and unofficial Boy Scouts, who, without uniform or badge or any kind of paraphernalia, followed the banner of Sir Robert Baden-Powell and subjected themselves to a rude discipline. They were far too poor to join an orthodox troop, but they faithfully copied what they believed to be the practices of more fortunate boys. Mr. McCunn had witnessed their pathetic parades, and had even passed the time of day with their leader, a red-haired savage called Dougal. The philanthropic Mackintosh had taken an interest in the gang and now desired subscriptions to send them to camp in the country. Mr. McCunn, in his new exhilaration, felt that he could not deny to others what he proposed for himself. His last act before leaving was to send Mackintosh £10. Chapter 2. Of Mr. John Heritage and the difference in points of view. Dickson McCunn was never to forget the first stage in that pilgrimage. A little after midday he descended from a grimy third-class carriage at a little station whose name I have forgotten. In the village near by he purchased some new baked buns and ginger biscuits, to which he was partial, and followed by the shouts of urchins, who admired his pack. Look at the old man gone to the shul, he emerged into open country. The late April noon gleamed like a frosty morning, but the air, though tonic, was kind. The road ran over sweeps of moorland where curlews wailed, and into lowland pastures dotted with very white, very vocal lambs. The young grass had the warm fragrance of new milk. As he went he munched his buns, for he had resolved to have no plethoric midday meal, and presently he found the burnt-side nook of his fancy, and halted to smoke. On a patch of turf close to a grey stone bridge he had out his Walton and read the chapter on the Chavender or Chub. The collocation of words delighted him and inspired him to verse. Lavender or lub, pavender or pub, gravender or grub, but the monosyllables proved too vulgar for poetry. Regretfully he desisted. The rest of the road was as idyllic as the start. He would tramp steadily for a mile or so and then saunter, leaning over bridges to watch the trout in the pools, admiring from a dry stone dike the unsteady gambols of new-born lambs, kicking up dust from strips of moor, burn on the heather. Once by a fir wood he was privileged to surprise 3 lunatic hares waltzing. His cheeks glowed with the sun, he moved in an atmosphere of pastoral, serene and contented. When the shadows began to lengthen he arrived at the village of Clonkey, where he proposed to lie. The inn looked dirty, but he found a decent widow, above whose door ran the legend in home-made lettering, Mrs. Brocky tea and coffee, and who was willing to give him quarters. There he supped handsomely off ham and eggs, and dipped into a wort called Covenanting Worthies, which garnished a table decorated with sea shells. At 9:30 precisely he retired to bed and unhesitating sleep. Next morning he awoke to a changed world. The sky was grey and so low that his outlook was bounded by a cabbage garden, while a surly wind prophesied rain. It was chilly, too, and he had his breakfast beside the kitchen fire. Mrs. Brocky could not spare a capital letter for her surname on the signboard, but she exalted it in her talk. He heard of a multitude of Brockies, ascendant, descendant and collateral, who seemed to be in a fair way to inherit the earth. Dickson listened sympathetically, and lingered by the fire. He felt stiff from yesterday's exercise, and the edge was off his spirit. The start was not quite what he had pictured. His pack seemed heavier, his boots tighter, and his pipe drew badly. The first miles were all uphill, with a wind tingling his ears, and no colors in the landscape but brown and grey. Suddenly he awoke to the fact that he was dismal, and thrust the notion behind him. He expanded his chest and drew in long draughts of air. He told himself that this sharp weather was better than sunshine. He remembered that all travelers in romances battled with mist and rain. Presently his body recovered comfort and vigor, and his mind worked itself into cheerfulness. He overtook a party of tramps and fell into talk with them. He had always had a fancy for the class, though he had never known anything nearer it than city beggars. He pictured them as philosophic vagabonds, full of quaint turns of speech, unconscious Barovians. With these samples his disillusionment was speedy. The party was made up of a ferret-faced man with a red nose, a draggle-tailed woman, and a child in a crazy perambulator. Their conversation was one-sided, for it immediately resolved itself into a whining chronicle of misfortunes and petitions for relief. It cost him half a crown to be rid of them. The road was alive with tramps that day. The next one did the accosting. Hailing Mr. McCunn as governor, he asked to be told the way to Manchester. The objective seemed so enterprising that Dickson was impelled to ask questions, and heard, in what appeared to be in the accents of the colonies, the tale of a career of unvarying calamity. There was nothing merry or philosophic about this adventurer. Nay, there was something menacing. He eyed his companion's waterproof covetously, and declared that he had had one like it which had been stolen from him the day before. Had the place been lonely he might have contemplated highway robbery, but they were at the entrance to a village, and the sight of a public house awoke his thirst. Dickson parted with him at the cost of 6pence for a drink. He had no more company that morning except an aged stone breaker whom he convoyed for half a mile. The stone breaker also was soured with the world. He walked with a limp, which, he said, was due to an accident years before, when he had been run into by they damned velocipedes. The word revived in Dickson memories of his youth, and he was prepared to be friendly. But the ancient would have none of it. He inquired morosely what he was after, and, on being told, remarked that he might have learned more sense. "It's a daft-like thing for an old man like you to be travelling the roads. Ye maun be off for a job." Questioned as to himself he became, as the newspapers say, reticent, and having reached his bing of stones, turned rudely to his duties. "Awa haim wie," were his parting words. "It's idle scoundrels like you that maks walk for honest folk like me." The morning was not a success, but the strong air had given Dickson such an appetite that he resolved to break his rule, and, on reaching the little town of Kilchrist, he sought luncheon at the chief hotel. There he found that which revived his spirits. A solitary bagman shared the meal, who revealed the fact that he was in the grocery line. There followed a well-informed and most technical conversation. He was drawn to speak of the United Supply Stores, Limited, of their prospects and of their predecessor, Mr. McCunn, whom he knew well by repute but had never met. "Yon's the clever one," he observed. "I've always said there's no longer head in the city of Glasgow than McCunn. An old-fashioned firm, but it has managed to keep up with the times. He's just retired, they tell me, and in my opinion it's a big loss to the provision trade." Dickson's heart glowed within him. Here was romance, to be praised incognito, to enter a casual inn and find that fame had preceded him. He warmed to the bagman, insisted on giving him a liqueur and a cigar, and finally revealed himself. "I'm Dickson McCunn," he said, taking a bit holiday. "If there's anything I can do for you when I get back, just let me know." With mutual esteem they parted. He had need of all his good spirits, for he emerged into an unrelenting drizzle. The environs of Kilchrist are at the best unlovely, and in the wet they were as melancholy as a graveyard. But the encounter with the bagman had worked wonders with Dickson, and he strode lustily into the weather, his waterproof collar buttoned round his chin. The road climbed to a bare moor, where lagoons had formed in the ruts, and the mist showed on each side only a yard or two of soaking heather. Soon he was wet, presently every part of him, boots, body and pack, was one vast sponge. The waterproof was not waterproof, and the rain penetrated to his most intimate garments. Little he cared. He felt lighter, younger, than on the idyllic previous day. He enjoyed the buffet of the storm, and one wet mile succeeded another to the accompaniment of Dickson's shouts and laughter. There was no one abroad that afternoon, so he could talk aloud to himself and repeat his favorite poems. About 5 in the evening there presented himself at the Black Bull Inn at Kirkmichael a soaked, disreputable, but most cheerful traveller. Now the Black Bull at Kirkmichael is one of the few very good inns left in the world. It is an old place and unhospitable, for it has been for generations a haunt of anglers, who above all other men understand comfort. There are always bright fires there, and hot water, and old soft leather armchairs, and an aroma of good food and good tobacco, and giant trout in glass cases, and pictures of Captain Barclay of Uri walking to London, and Mr. Ramsay of Barnton winning a horse race, and the 3-volume edition of the Waverley novels with many volumes missing, and indeed all those things which an inn should have. Also there may still be sound vintage claret in the cellars. The Black Bull expects its guests to arrive in every stage of dishevelment, and Dickson was received by a cordial landlord, who offered dry garments as a matter of course. The pack proved to have resisted the elements, and a suit of clothes and slippers were provided by the house. Dickson, after a glass of toddy, wallowed in a hot bath, which washed all the stiffness out of him. He had a fire in his bedroom, beside which he wrote the opening passages of that diary he had vowed to keep, descanting lyrically upon the joys of ill weather. At 7 o'clock, warm and satisfied in soul, and with his body clad in raiment several sizes too large for it, he descended to dinner. At one end of the long table in the dining room sat a group of anglers. They looked jovial fellows, and Dickson would fain have joined them, but, having been fishing all day in the loch o' the Threshes, they were talking their own talk, and he feared that his admiration for Isaac Walton did not qualify him to butt into the erudite discussions of fishermen. The landlord seemed to think likewise, for he drew back a chair for him at the other end, where sat a young man absorbed in a book. Dickson gave him good evening and got an abstracted reply. The young man supped the Black Bull's excellent broth with one hand, and with the other turned the pages of his volume. A glance convinced Dickson that the work was French, a literature which did not interest him. He knew little of the tongue and suspected it of impropriety. Another guest entered and took the chair opposite the bookish young man. He was also young, not more than 33, and to Dickson's eye, was the kind of person he would have liked to resemble. He was tall and free from any superfluous flesh, his face was lean, fine, drawn and deeply sunburnt so that the hair above showed oddly pale, the hands were brown and beautifully shaped, but the forearm revealed by the loose cuffs of his shirt was as brawny as a blacksmith's. He had rather pale blue eyes, which seemed to have looked much at the sun, and a small moustache the colour of ripe hay. His voice was low and pleasant, and he pronounced his words precisely, like a foreigner. He was very ready to talk, but in defiance of Dr. Johnson's warning, his talk was all questions. He wanted to know everything about the neighbourhood, who lived in what houses, what were the distances between the towns, what harbours would admit what class of vessel. Smiling agreeably, he put Dickson through a catechism to which he knew none of the answers. The landlord was called in, and proved more helpful. But on one matter he was fairly at a loss. The catechist asked about a house called Darkwater, and was met with a shake of the head. "I know no like name in this countryside, sir," and the catechist looked disappointed. The literary young man said nothing, but ate trout abstractedly, one eye on his book. The fish had been caught by the anglers in the loch o' the Threshes, and phrases describing their capture floated from the other end of the table. The young man had a second helping, and then refused the excellent hill mutton that followed, contenting himself with cheese. Not so Dickson and the catechist. They ate everything that was set before them, topping up with a glass of port. Then the latter, who had been talking illuminatingly about Spain, rose, bowed and left the table, leaving Dickson, who liked to linger over his meals, to the society of the ichthyophagous student. He nodded towards the book. "Interesting?" he asked. The young man shook his head and displayed the name on the cover. Anatole, France. I used to be crazy about him, but now he seems rather a back number. Then he glanced towards the just vacated chair. Australian, he said. How do you know? Can't mistake them. There's nothing else so lean and fine produced on the globe today. I was next door to them at Posier's and saw them fight. Lord! Such men! Now and then you had a freak, but most looked like Phoebus Apollo. Dickson gazed with a new respect at his neighbor, for he had not associated him with battlefields. During the war he had been a fervent patriot, but, though he had never heard a shot himself, so many of his friends' sons and nephews, not to mention cousins of his own, had seen service, that he had come to regard the experience as commonplace. Lions in Africa and bandits in Mexico seemed to him novel and romantic things, but not trenches and airplanes which were the whole world's property. But he could scarcely fit his neighbor into even his haziest picture of war. The young man was tall and a little round-shouldered. He had short-sighted, rather prominent brown eyes, untidy black hair and dark eyebrows which came near to meeting. He wore a knickerbocker suit of bluish-grey tweed, a pale blue shirt, a pale blue collar and a dark blue tie, a symphony of color which seemed too elaborately considered to be quite natural. Dickson had set him down as an artist or a newspaper correspondent, objects to him of lively interest. But now the classification must be reconsidered. So you were in the war, he said encouragingly. For blasted years, was the savage reply. And I never want to hear the name of the beastly thing again. You said he was an Australian, said Dickson, casting back. But I thought Australians had a queer accent, like the English. They've all kind of accents, but you can never mistake their voice. It's got the sun in it. Canadians have got grinding ice in theirs, and Virginians have got butter. So have the Irish. In Britain there are no voices, only speaking tubes. It isn't safe to judge men by their accent only. You yourself I take to be Scotch, but for all I know you may be a senator from Chicago or a Boer general. I'm from Glasgow. My name's Dickson McCunn. He had a faint hope that the announcement might affect the other as it had affected the bagman at Kilchrist. Golly, what a name, exclaimed the young man rudely. Dickson was nettled. It's very old Highland, he said. It means the son of a dog. Which Christian name or surname? Then the young man appeared to think he had gone too far, for he smiled pleasantly. And a very good name too. Mine is prosaic by comparison. They call me John Heritage. That, said Dickson, mollified, is like a name out of a book. With that name by rights you should be a poet. Gloom settled on the young man's countenance. It's a dashed sight too poetic. It's like Edwin Arnold and Alfred Austin and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Great poets have vulgar monosyllables for names, like Keats. The new Shakespeare when he comes along will probably be called Grubb or Jubber, if he isn't Jones. With a name like yours I might have a chance. You should be the poet. I'm very fond of reading, said Dickson modestly. A slow smile crumpled Mr. Heritage's face. There's a fire in the smoking room, he observed as he rose. We'd better bag the armchairs before these fishing louts take them. Dickson followed obediently. This was the kind of chance acquaintance for whom he had hoped, and he was prepared to make the most of him. The fire burned bright in the little dusky smoking room, lighted by one oil lamp. Mr. Heritage flung himself into a chair, stretched his long legs and lit a pipe. You like reading? He asked. What sort? Any use for poetry? Plenty, said Dickson. I been fond of learning it up and repeating it to myself when I had nothing to do. In church and waiting on trains, like. It used to be Tennyson, but now it's more Browning. I can say a lot of Browning. The other screwed his face into an expression of disgust. I know the stuff. damask cheeks and dewy sister eyelids. Or else the Usiles vain, God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. No good, Mr. McCunn. All back numbers. Poetry's not a thing of pretty round phrases or noisy invocations. It's life itself, with the tang of the raw world in it, not a sweetmeat for middle-class women in parlors. Are you a poet, Mr. Heritage? No, dogson, I'm a paper maker. This was a new view to Mr. McCunn. I just once knew a paper maker, he observed reflectively. They called him Tosh. He drank a bit. Well, I don't drink, said the other. I'm a paper maker, but that's for my bread and butter. Someday for my own sake I may be a poet. Have you published anything? The eager admiration in Dickson's tone gratified Mr. Heritage. He drew from his pocket a slim book. My first fruits, he said, rather shyly. Dickson received it with reverence. It was a small volume in grey paperboards with a white label on the back, and it was lettered, Wells, John Heritage's book. He turned the pages and read a little. It's a nice wee book, he observed at length. Good God, if you call it nice, I must have failed pretty badly, was the irritated answer. Dickson read more deeply and was puzzled. It seemed worse than the worst of Browning to understand. He found one poem about a garden entitled Review. Crimson and resonant clangs the dawn, said the poet. Then he went on to describe noonday. Sunflowers, tall grenadiers, ogle the roses' short-skirted ballet. The fumes of dark sweet wine hidden in frail petals. Madden the drunkard bees. This seemed to him an odd way to look at things, and he boggled over a phrase about an epicene lily. Then came evening, the painted gauze of the stars flutters in a fold of twilight crape, sang Mr. Heritage, and again, the moon's pale leprosy sloughs the fields. Dickson turned to other verses which apparently enshrined the writer's memory of the trenches. They were largely compounded of oaths, and rather horrible, lingering lovingly over sights and smells which everyone is aware of, but most people contrive to forget. He did not like them. Finally he skimmed a poem about a lady who turned into a bird. The evolution was described with intimate anatomical details which scared the honest reader. He kept his eyes on the book for he did not know what to say. The trick seemed to be to describe nature in metaphors mostly drawn from music, halls and haberdashers' shops, and, when at a loss, to fall to cursing. He thought it frankly very bad, and he labored to find words which would combine politeness and honesty. Well, said the poet. There's a lot of fine things here, but the lines don't just seem to scan very well. Mr. Heritage laughed. Now I can place you exactly. You like the meek rhyme and the conventional epithet. Well, I don't. The world has passed beyond that prettiness. You want the moon described as a huntress or a gold disc or a flower, I say it's oftener like a beer barrel or a cheese. You want a wealth of jolly words and real things ruled out as unfit for poetry. I say there's nothing unfit for poetry. Nothing, dog son. Poetry's everywhere, and the real thing is commoner among drabs and pot houses and rubbish heaps than in your Sunday parlors. The poet's business is to distill it out of rottenness, and show that it is all one spirit, the thing that keeps the stars in their place. I wanted to call my book Drains, for drains are sheer poetry, carrying off the excess and discards of human life to make the fields green and the corn ripen. But the publishers kicked. So I called it Whirls. To express my view of the exquisite involution of all things. Poetry is the fourth dimension of the soul. Well, let's hear about your taste in prose. Mr. McCunn was much bewildered, and a little inclined to be cross. He disliked being called dog-son, which seemed to him an abuse of his etymological confidences. But his habit of politeness held. He explained rather haltingly his preferences in prose. Mr. Heritage listened with wrinkled brows. You're even deeper in the mud than I thought, he remarked. You live in a world of painted laths and shadows. All this passion for the picturesque. Trash, my dear man, like a schoolgirl's novelette heroes. You make up romances about gypsies and sailors and the blackguards they call pioneers, but you know nothing about them. If you did, you would find they had none of the gilt and gloss you imagine. But the great things they have got in common with all humanity you ignore. It's like sentimentalizing about a pancake because it looked like a buttercup, and all the while not knowing that it was good to eat. At that moment the Australian entered the room to get a light for his pipe. He wore a motor-cyclist's overalls and appeared to be about to take the road. He bade them good night, and it seemed to Dickson that his face, seen in the glow of the fire, was drawn and anxious, unlike that of the agreeable companion at dinner. "There," said Mr. Heritage, nodding after the departing figure. "I dare say you have been telling yourself stories about that chap, life in the bush, stock riding and the rest of it. But probably he's a bank clerk from Melbourne. Your romanticism is one vast self-delusion, and it blinds your eye to the real thing. We have got to clear it out, and with it all the damnable humbug of the Celt." Mr. McCunn, who spelt the word with a soft C, was puzzled. "I thought a Celt was a kind of a no-will fish," he interposed. But the other, in the flood tide of his argument, ignored the interruption. "That's the value of the war," he went on. "It has burst up all the old conventions, and we've got to finish the destruction before we can build. It is the same with literature and religion and society and politics. At them with the axe, say I. I have no use for priests and pedants. I've no use for upper classes and middle classes. There's only one class that matters, the plain man, the workers, who live close to life." "The place for you," said Dickson dryly, "is in Russia among the Bolsheviks." Mr. Heritage approved. "They are doing a great work in their own fashion. We needn't imitate all their methods, they are a trifle crude and have too many Jews among them, but they've got hold of the right end of the stick. They seek truth and reality." Mr. McCunn was slowly being roused. "What brings you wandering hereaways?" he asked. "Exercise," was the answer. "I've been kept pretty closely tied up all winter. And I want leisure and quiet to think over things." "Well, there's one subject you might turn your attention to. You'll have been educated like a gentleman. 9 wasted years, 5 at Harrow, 4 at Cambridge. See here, then. You're daft about the working class and have no use for any other. But what in the name of goodness do you know about working men? I come out of them myself, and have lived next door to them all my days. Take them one way and another, they are a decent sort, good and bad like the rest of us. But there's a wheen daft folk that would set them up as models, close to truth and reality, says you. It's sheer ignorance, for you're about as well acquaint with the working man as with King Solomon. You say I make up fine stories about tinklers and sailor men because I know nothing about them. That's maybe true. But you're at the same job yourself. You idolize the working man, you and your kind, because you're ignorant. You say that he's seeking for truth, when he's only looking for a drink and a rise in wages. You tell me he's near reality, but I tell you that his notion of reality is often just a short working day and looking on at a football match on Saturday. And when you run down what you call the middle classes that do 3/4 of the world's work and keep the machine going and the working man in a job, then I tell you you're talking havers. Havers. Mr. McCunn, having delivered his defense of the bourgeoisie, rose abruptly and went to bed. He felt jarred and irritated. His innocent little private domain had been badly trampled by this stray bull of a poet. But as he lay in bed, before blowing out his candle, he had recourse to Walton, and found a passage on which, as on a pillow, he went peacefully to sleep. As I left this place, and entered into the next field, a second pleasure entertained me, 'twas a handsome milkmaid, that had not yet attained so much age and wisdom as to load her mind with any fears of many things that will never be, as too many men too often do, but she cast away all care, and sang like a nightingale. Her voice was good, and the ditty fitted for it. It was the smooth song that was made by Kit Marlowe now at least 50 years ago. And the milkmaid's mother sung an answer to it, which was made by Sir Walter Raleigh in his younger days. They were old-fashioned poetry, but choicely good, I think much better than the strong lines that are now in fashion in this critical age. Chapter 3. How Childe Roland and Another Came to the Dark Tower. Dickson woke with a vague sense of irritation. As his recollections took form, they produced a very unpleasant picture of Mr. John Heritage. The poet had loosened all his placid idols, so that they shook and rattled in the niches where they had been erstwhile so secure. Mr. McCunn had a mind of a singular candour, and was prepared most honestly at all times to revise his views. But by this iconoclast he had been only irritated and in no way convinced. Sich poetry, he muttered to himself as he shivered in his bath, a daily cold tub instead of his customary hot one on Saturday night being part of the discipline of his holiday. And yon blethers about the working man, he ingeminated as he shaved. He breakfasted alone, having outstripped even the fishermen, and as he ate he arrived at conclusions. He had a great respect for youth, but a line must be drawn somewhere. The man's a child, he decided, and not like to grow up. The way he's besotted on everything daft-like, if it's only new. And he's no rightly young either, speaks like an old dominie, whiles. And he's rather impudent, he concluded, with memories of Dogson. He was very clear that he never wanted to see him again, that was the reason of his early breakfast. Having clarified his mind by definitions, Dickson felt comforted. He paid his bill, took an affectionate farewell of the landlord, and at 7:30 precisely stepped out into the gleaming morning. It was such a day as only a Scots April can show. The cobbled streets of Kirkmichael still shone with the night's rain, but the storm clouds had fled before a mild south wind, and the whole circumference of the sky was a delicate translucent blue. Homely breakfast smells came from the houses and delighted Mr. McCunn's nostrils. A squalling child was a pleasant reminder of an awakening world, the urban counterpart to the morning song of birds. Even the sanitary cart seemed a picturesque vehicle. He bought his ration of buns and ginger biscuits at a baker's shop whence various ragamuffin boys were preparing to distribute the householders' bread, and took his way up the Gallows Hill to the Boroughmuir almost with regret at leaving so pleasant a habitation. A chronicle of ripe vintages must pass lightly over small beer. I will not dwell on his leisurely progress in the bright weather, or on his luncheon in a coppice of young firs, or on his thoughts which had returned to the idyllic. I take up the narrative at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when he is revealed seated on a milestone examining his map. For he had come, all unwitting, to a turning of the ways, and his choice is the cause of this veracious history. The place was high up on a bare moor, which showed a white lodge among pines, a white cottage in a green nook by a burnside, and no other marks of human dwelling. To his left, which was the east, the heather rose to a low ridge of hill, much scarred with peat bogs, behind which appeared the blue shoulder of a considerable mountain. Before him the road was lost momentarily in the woods of a shooting box, but reappeared at a great distance climbing a swell of upland which seemed to be the glacis of a jumble of bold summits. There was a pass there, the map told him, which led into Galloway. It was the road he had meant to follow, but as he sat on the milestone his purpose wavered. For there seemed greater attractions in the country which lay to the westward. Mr. McCunn, be it remembered, was not in search of brown heath and shaggy wood, he wanted greenery and the spring. Westward there ran out a peninsula in the shape of an isosceles triangle, of which his present highroad was the base. At a distance of a mile or so a railway ran parallel to the road, and he could see the smoke of a goods train waiting at a tiny station islanded in acres of bog. Thence the moor swept down to meadows and scattered copses, above which hung a thin haze of smoke which betokened a village. Beyond it were further woodlands, not firs but old shady trees, and as they narrowed to a point the gleam of two tiny estuaries appeared on either side. He could not see the final cape, but he saw the sea beyond it, floored with catspaws, gold in the afternoon sun, and on it a small herring smack flapping listless sails. Something in the view caught and held his fancy. He conned his map, and made out the names. The peninsula was called the Cruives, an old name apparently, for it was in antique lettering. He vaguely remembered that Cruives had something to do with fishing, doubtless in the two streams which flanked it. One he had already crossed, the Lava, a clear tumbling water springing from green hills, the other, the Garple, descended from the rougher mountains to the south. The hidden village bore the name of Dalkharter, and the uncouth syllables awoke some vague recollection in his mind. The great house in the trees beyond, it must be a great house, for the map showed large policies, was Huntington. The last name fascinated and almost decided him. He pictured an ancient keep by the sea, defended by converging rivers, which some old common lord of Galloway had built to command the shore road and from which he had sallied to hunt in his wild hills. He liked the way the moor dropped down to green meadows, and the mystery of the dark woods beyond. He wanted to explore the twin waters, and see how they entered that strange shimmering sea. The odd names, the odd cul-de-sac of a peninsula, powerfully attracted him. Why should he not spend a night there, for the map showed clearly that Dalkharter had an inn. He must decide promptly, for before him a side road left the highway, and the signpost bore the legend, Dalkharter and Huntington. Mr. McCunn, being a cautious and pious man, took the omens. He tossed a penny, heads go on, tails turn aside. It fell tails. He knew as soon as he had taken 3 steps down the side road that he was doing something momentous, and the exhilaration of enterprise stole into his soul. It occurred to him that this was the kind of landscape that he had always especially hankered after, and had made pictures of when he had a longing for the country on him, a wooded cape between streams, with meadows inland and then a long lift of heather. He had the same feeling of expectancy, of something most interesting and curious on the eve of happening, that he had had long ago when he waited on the curtain rising at his first play. His spirit soared like the lark, and he took to singing. If only the inn at Dalkharter were snug and empty, this was going to be a day in 10,000. Thus mirthfully he swung down the rough grass-grown road, past the railway, till he came to a point where heath began to merge in pasture, and dry stone walls split the moor into fields. Suddenly his pace slackened and song died on his lips. For, approaching from the right by a tributary path, was the poet. Mr. Heritage saw him afar off and waved a friendly hand. In spite of his chagrin, Dickson could not but confess that he had misjudged his critic. Striding with long steps over the heather, his jacket open to the wind, his face aglow and his capless head like a bush for disorder, he cut a more wholesome and picturesque figure than in the smoking room the night before. He seemed to be in a companionable mood, for he brandished his stick and shouted greetings. "Well met," he cried, "I was hoping to fall in with you again. You must have thought me a pretty fair cub last night." "I did that," was the dry answer. "Well, I want to apologize. God knows what made me treat you to a university extension lecture. I may not agree with you, but every man's entitled to his own views, and it was dashed poor form for me to start jawing you." Mr. McCunn had no gift of nursing anger, and was very susceptible to apologies. "That's all right," he murmured. "Don't mention it. I'm wondering what brought you down here, for it's off the road." "Caprice. Pure caprice. I like the look of this but end of nowhere." "Same here. I thought there was something terrible nice about a wee cape with a village at the neck of it and a burn each side." "Now that's interesting," said Mr. Heritage. "You're obsessed by a particular type of landscape. Ever read Freud?" Dickson shook his head. "Well, you've got an odd complex somewhere. I wonder where the key lies. Cape, woods, 2 rivers, more behind. Ever been in love, dog-son?" Mr. McCunn was startled. Love was a word rarely mentioned in his circle except on death-beds. "I've been a married man for 30 years, he said hurriedly. "That won't do. It should have been a hopeless affair, the last sight of the lady on a spur of coast with water on three sides, that kind of thing, you know. Or it might have happened to an ancestor. But you don't look the kind of breed for hopeless attachments. More likely some scoundrelly old dogson long ago found sanctuary in this sort of place. Do you dream about it? Not exactly. Well, I do. The queer thing is that I've got the same prepossession as you. As soon as I spotted this Cruives place on the map this morning, I saw it was what I was after. When I came in sight of it I almost shouted. I don't very often dream, but when I do that's the place I frequent. Odd, isn't it? Mr. McCunn was deeply interested at this unexpected revelation of romance. Maybe it's being in love, he daringly observed. The poet demurred. No. I'm not a connoisseur of obvious sentiment. That explanation might fit your case, but not mine. I'm pretty certain there's something hideous at the back of my complex, some grim old business tucked away back in the ages. For though I'm attracted by the place, I'm frightened too. There seemed no room for fear in the delicate landscape now opening before them. In fronting groves of birch and rowan smoked the first houses of a tiny village. The road had become a green loaning on the ample margin of which cattle grazed. The moorland still showed itself in spits of heather, and some distance off, where a rivulet ran in a hollow, there were signs of a fire and figures near it. These last Mr. Heritage regarded with disapproval. Some infernal trippers, he murmured. Or Boy Scouts. They desecrate everything. Why can't the tunicators Papellus keep away from a paradise like this? Dickson, a Democrat who felt nothing incongruous in the presence of other holiday makers, was meditating a sharp rejoinder, when Mr. Heritage's tone changed. Ye gods! What a village, he cried, as they turned a corner. There were not more than a dozen whitewashed houses, all set in little gardens of wallflower and daffodil and early fruit blossom. A triangle of green filled the intervening space, and in it stood an ancient wooden pump. There was no schoolhouse or kirk, not even a post office, only a red box in a cottage side. Beyond rose the high wall and the dark trees of the domain, and to the right up a by road which clung to the park edge stood a two-storied building which bore the legend the Cruives Inn. The poet became lyrical. At last, he cried. The village of my dreams. Not a sign of commerce. No church or school or beastly recreation hall. Nothing but these divine little cottages and an ancient pub. Dogson, I warn you, I'm going to have the devil of a tea. And he declaimed. Thou shalt hear a song. After a while which gods may listen to. But place the flask upon the board and wait. Until the stranger hath allayed his thirst. For poets, grasshoppers, and nightingales sing cheerily but when the throat is moist. Dickson, too, longed with sensual gusto for tea. But, as they drew nearer, the inn lost its hospitable look. The cobbles of the yard were weedy, as if rarely visited by traffic, a pane in a window was broken, and the blinds hung tattered. The garden was a wilderness, and the doorstep had not been scoured for weeks. But the place had a landlord, for he had seen them approach and was waiting at the door to meet them. He was a big man in his shirt sleeves, wearing old riding breeches unbuttoned at the knees, and thick ploughman's boots. He had no leggings, and his fleshy calves were imperfectly covered with woolen socks. His face was large and pale, his neck bulged, and he had a gross unshaven jowl. He was a type familiar to students of society, not the innkeeper, which is a thing consistent with good breeding and all the refinements, a type not unknown in the House of Lords, especially among recent creations, common enough in the House of Commons and the City of London, and by no means infrequent in the governing circles of Labour, the type known to the discerning as the licensed victualler. His face was wrinkled in official smiles, and he gave the travellers a hearty good afternoon. Can we stop here for the night? Dickson asked. The landlord looked sharply at him, and then replied to Mr. Heritage. His expression passed from official bonhomie to official contrition. Impossible, gentlemen. Quite impossible. Ye couldn't have come at a worse time. I've only been here a fortnight myself, and we haven't got right shaken down yet. Even then I might have made shift to do with ye, but the fact is we've illness in the house, and I'm fair at my wits' end. It breaks my heart to turn gentlemen away and me that keen to get the business started. But there it is. He spat vigorously as if to emphasize the desperation of his quandary. The man was clearly Scots, but his native speech was overlaid with something alien, something which might have been acquired in America or in going down to the sea in ships. He hitched his breeches, too, with a nautical air. Is there nowhere else we can put up? Dickson asked. Not in this one horse place. Just a ween old wives that packed thegither they haven't room for an extra hen. But it's grand weather, and it's not above 7 miles to Auchenlaken. Say the word and I'll yoke the horse and drive ye there. Thank you. We prefer to walk, said Mr. Heritage. Dickson would have tarried to inquire after the illness in the house, but his companion hurried him off. Once he looked back, and saw the landlord still on the doorstep gazing after them. That fellow's a swine, said Mr. Heritage sourly. I wouldn't trust my neck in his pothouse. Now, dogson, I'm hanged if I'm going to leave this place. We'll find a corner in the village somehow. Besides, I'm determined on tea. The little street slept in the clear pure light of an early April evening. Blue shadows lay on the white road, and a delicate aroma of cooking tantalized hungry nostrils. The near meadows shone like pale gold against the dark lift of the moor. A light wind had begun to blow from the west and carried the faintest tang of salt. The village at that hour was pure paradise, and Dickson was of the poet's opinion. At all costs they must spend the night there. They selected a cottage whiter and neater than the others, which stood at a corner, where a narrow lane turned southward. Its thatched roof had been lately repaired, and starched curtains of a dazzling whiteness decorated the small, closely shut windows. Likewise it had a green door and a polished brass knocker. Tacitly the duty of envoy was entrusted to Mr. McCunn. Leaving the other at the gate, he advanced up the little path lined with court stones, and politely but firmly dropped the brass knocker. He must have been observed, for ere the noise had ceased the door opened, and an elderly woman stood before him. She had a sharply cut face, the rudiments of a beard, big spectacles on her nose, and an old-fashioned lace cap on her smooth white hair. A little grim she looked at first sight, because of her thin lips and Roman nose, but her mild, curious eyes corrected the impression and gave the envoy confidence. Good afternoon, mistress, he said, broadening his voice to something more rustical than his normal Glasgow speech. Me and my friend are paying our first visit here, and we're terrible taken up with the place. We would like to bide the night, but the inn is no taking folk. Is there any chance, think you, of a bed here? I'll no tell ye a lee, said the woman. There's 2 good beds in the loft. But I dinna tak lodgers and I dinna want to be bothered wi'. I'm an old woman and no astute as I was. Ye'd better try down the street. Eppy home mick tak ye. Dickson wore his most ingratiating smile. But, mistress, Eppy Home's house is no yours. We've taken a tremendous fancy to this bit. Can you no manage to put with us for the one night? We're quiet old-fashioned folk and will no trouble you much. Just our tea and maybe an egg to it, and a bowl of porridge in the morning. The woman seemed to relent. Was your friend? She asked, peering over her spectacles towards the garden gate. The waiting Mr. Heritage, seeing her eyes moving in his direction, took off his cap with a brave gesture and advanced. Glorious weather, madam, he declared. English, whispered Dickson to the woman, in explanation. She examined the poet's neat clothes and Mr. McCunn's homely garments, and apparently found them reassuring. Come in, she said shortly. I see ye re will for folk and I'll ha' today my best for ye. A quarter of an hour later the two travellers, having been introduced to two spotless beds in the loft, and having washed luxuriously at the pump in the backyard, were seated in Mrs. Moran's kitchen before a meal which fulfilled their wildest dreams. She had been baking that morning, so there were white scones and barley scones, and oaten farles, and russet pancakes. There were 3 boiled eggs for each of them, there was a segment of an immense currant cake, a present from my gid Brit her last hogmanay, there was skim milk cheese, there were several kinds of jam, and there was a pot of dark, gold heather honey. "Try hinnianate cake," said their hostess. "My man used to say he never fund onything as good in a his days." Presently they heard her story. Her name was Moran, and she had been a widow these 10 years. Of her family her son was in South Africa, one daughter a lady's maid in London, and the other married to a schoolmaster in Kyle. The son had been in France fighting, and had come safely through. He had spent a month or 2 with her before his return, and, she feared, had found it dull. "There's no a man body in the place. Nathing but old wives." That was what the innkeeper had told them. Mr. McCunn inquired concerning the inn. "There's new folk just come." "What's this they say them, Robson, Dobson, aye, Dobson? What for would they no take ye in? Does the man think he's a lad to refuse folk that gate?" He said he had illness in the house. Mrs. Moran meditated. "Way in the world can be lying there? The man bides his lane. He got a lassie frae or Kenlacan to cook, but she and her box gaed off in the post, ket ye streen. I doot he tell ye a lee, though it's no for me to judge him. I've never spoken a word to ane o' they new folk." Dickson inquired about the new folk. "They are new come in the last 3 weeks, and there's no a man o' the old stock left. John Blackstock's at the West Lodge Dido Newmany last back end, and old Simon Tappie at the Gerdons flitted to Mabel a year come met in Mars. There's naebody at the Gerdons new, but there's a man come to the West Lodge, a black-avised body wi a face like bend leather. Tam Robison used to bide at the South Lodge, but Tam got killed about Mesopotamie, and his wife took the bairns to her guidesire up at the Garple Hide. I seen the man that's in the South Lodge gone up the street when I was finishin' my dinner, a shilpit body and a lame ter, but he hurples as fast as ither folk run. He's no bonny to look at. I canna think what the fact is etlin at to let sick ill Ford Kyles come about the town." Their hostess was rapidly rising in Dickson's esteem. She sat very straight in her chair, eating with the careful gentility of a bird, and priming her thin lips after every mouthful of tea. "Who bides in the big house?" he asked. "Huntington is the name, isn't it? When I was a lassie they caed it Dalkharter House, and Huntington was the old Rickle stands at the sea end. But nathing would serve the last laird's faither but he maun change the name, for he was clean daft about what they ca antiquities. Ye spieway bides in the House? Naebody, since the young laird deed. It's standing cold and lanely and stikit, and it ain't the cheeriest dwallin' in a carrick." Mrs. Moran's tone grew tragic. "It's a queer walled wi out the old gentry. My faither and my guidesire and his faither afore him served the Kennedys, and my man Dorvit Moran was gemkeeper to them, and afore I married I was ane o' the table maids. They were kind folk, the Kennedys, and, like o' the royal gentry, maist mindfu o' them that served them. Sic merry nichts I've seen in the old Hoose, at Halloween and Hogmanay, and at the servants' balls and the wardings o' the young leddies. But the laird bode to waste his siller in stain and lime, and hadna that much to leave to his bairns. And now they've a scattered or deed." Her grave face wore the tenderness which comes from affectionate reminiscence. "There was never sic a laddie as young Maister Quentin. No a week gaed by but he was in here, crying, 'Femi Moran, I've come till my tea.' Fine he lickit my treacle scones, pure man. There wasna ane in the countryside sae bold a rider at the hunt, or sic a skeely fisher. And he was clever at his books tie, a grand scholar, they said, and etlin at being what they ca a diplomat. But that's a by wi dot. Quentin Kennedy, the fellow in the tins? Heritage asked. I saw him in Rome when he was with the mission. I dinna ken. He was a brave soldier, but he wasna long fechtin in France till he got a bullet in his breast. Syne we heard tell o' him in far-awa bits like Russia, and syne cam the end o' the war and we look it to see him back, fishin' the waters and riding like Jay as in the old days. But ways me, it wasna permitted. The next news we got, the pure laddie was deed o' influenza and buried somewhere about France. The wanchancy bullet maun have weakened his chest, nae doot. So that's the end o' the good stock o' Kennedy o' Huntington, we ha' been great folks in the time o' Robert Bruce. And neither whose is shut up till the lawyers can get somebody sae far left to himsel as to tak it on lease, and in they dear days it's no just ony body that wants a muckle castle. Who are the lawyers? Dickson asked. Glendonan and Spears in Embro. But they never look near the place, and Maester Loudown in Auchenlacan does the factorin. He's let the publican filled the twa lodges, and he'll be thinking nae doot that he's done in Uch. Mrs. Moran had poured some hot water into the big slop bowl, and had begun the operation known as sinding out the cups. It was a hint that the meal was over and Dickson and Heritage rose from the table. Followed by an injunction to be back for supper on the Chapo 9, they strolled out into the evening. 2 hours of some sort of daylight remained, and the travellers had that impulse to activity which comes to all men who, after a day of exercise and emptiness, are stayed with a satisfying tea. You should be happy, dog son, said the poet. Here we have all the materials for your blessed romance: old mansion, extinct family, village deserted of men, and an innkeeper whom I suspect of being a villain. I feel almost a convert to your nonsense myself. We'll have a look at the house. They turned down the road which ran north by the park wall, past the inn which looked more abandoned than ever, till they came to an entrance which was clearly the West Lodge. It had once been a pretty, modish cottage, with a thatched roof and dormer windows, but now it was badly in need of repair. A window pane was broken and stuffed with a sack, the posts of the porch were giving inwards, and the thatch was crumbling under the attentions of a colony of starlings. The great iron gates were rusty, and on the coat of arms above them the gilding was patchy and tarnished. Apparently the gates were locked, and even the side wicket failed to open to Heritage's vigorous shaking. Inside, a weedy drive disappeared among ragged rhododendrons. The noise brought a man to the lodge door. He was a sturdy fellow in a suit of black clothes which had not been made for him. He might have been a butler en déshabillé, but for the presence of a pair of filled boots into which he had tucked the ends of his trousers. The curious thing about him was his face, which was decorated with features so tiny as to give the impression of a monstrous child. Each in itself was well enough formed, but eyes, nose, mouth, chin were of a smallness curiously out of proportion to the head and body. Such an anomaly might have been redeemed by the expression, good humour would have invested it with an air of agreeable farce. But there was no friendliness in the man's face. It was set like a judge's in a stony impassiveness. May we walk up to the house? Heritage asked. We are here for a night and should like to have a look at it. The man advanced a step. He had either a bad cold, or a voice comparable in size to his features. There's no entrance here, he said huskily. I have strict orders. Oh, come now, said Heritage. It can do nobody any harm if you let us in for half an hour. The man advanced another step. You shall not come in. Go away from here. Go away, I tell you. It is private. The words spoken by the small mouth in the small voice had a kind of childish ferocity. The travellers turned their back on him and continued their way. Sich a curmudgeon, Dickson commented. His face had flushed, for he was susceptible to rudeness. Did you notice? That man's a foreigner. He's a brute, said Heritage. But I'm not going to be done in by that class of lad. There can be no gates on the seaside, so we'll work round that way, for I won't sleep till I've seen the place." Presently the trees grew thinner, and the road plunged through thickets of hazel till it came to a sudden stop in a field. There the cover ceased wholly, and below them lay the glen of the lava. Steep green banks descended to a stream which swept in coils of gold into the eye of the sunset. A little further down the channel broadened, the slopes fell back a little, and a tongue of glittering sea ran up to meet the hill waters. The lava is a gentle stream after it leaves its cradle heights, a stream of clear pools and long bright shallows, winding by moorland steadings and upland meadows, but in its last half-mile it goes mad, and imitates its childhood when it tumbled over granite shelves. Down in that green place the crystal water gushed and frolicked as if determined on 1 hour of rapturous life before joining the sedater sea. Heritage flung himself on the turf. "This is a good place. Ye gods, what a good place! Dogson, aren't you glad you came? I think everything's bewitched tonight. That village is bewitched, and that old woman's tea. Good white magic. And that foul innkeeper and that brigand at the gate. Black magic. And now here is the home of all enchantment, island valley of Avilion, waters that listen for lovers, all the rest of it." Dickson observed and marveled. "I can't make you out, Mr. Heritage. You were saying last night you were a great Democrat, and yet you were objecting to yon laddies camping on the moor. And you very near bit the neb off me when I said I liked Tennyson. And now?" Mr. McCunn's command of language was inadequate to describe the transformation. "You're a precise, pragmatical Scot," was the answer. "Hang it, man, don't remind me that I'm inconsistent. I've a poet's license to play the fool, and if you don't understand me, I don't in the least understand myself. All I know is that I'm feeling young and jolly and that it's the spring." Mr. Heritage was assuredly in a strange mood. He began to whistle with a far-away look in his eye. "Do you know what that is?" he asked suddenly. Dickson, who could not detect any tune, said no. "It's an aria from a Russian opera that came out just before the war. I've forgotten the name of the fellow who wrote it. Jolly thing, isn't it? I always remind myself of it when I'm in this mood, for it is linked with the greatest experience of my life." "You said, I think, that you had never been in love?" Dickson replied in the native fashion. "Have you?" he asked. "I have, and I am been for 2 years. I was down with my battalion on the Italian front early in 1918, and because I could speak the language they hoiked me out and sent me to Rome on a liaison job. It was Easter time and fine weather and, being glad to get out of the trenches, I was pretty well pleased with myself and enjoying life. In the place where I stayed there was a girl. She was a Russian, a princess of a great family, but a refugee and of course as poor as sin. I remember how badly dressed she was among all the well-to-do Romans. But, my God, what a beauty! There was never anything in the world like her. She was little more than a child, and she used to sing that air in the morning as she went down the stairs. They sent me back to the front before I had a chance of getting to know her, but she used to give me little timid good mornings, and her voice and eyes were like an angel's. I'm over my head in love, but it's hopeless, quite hopeless. I shall never see her again." "I'm sure I'm honored by your confidence," said Dickson reverently. The poet, who seemed to draw exhilaration from the memory of his sorrows, arose and fetched him a clout on the back. "Don't talk of confidence as if you were a reporter," he said. "What about that house? If we're to see it before the dark comes we'd better hustle." The green slopes on their left, as they ran seaward, were clothed towards their summit with a tangle of brim and light scrub. The two forced their way through this, and found to their surprise that on this side there were no defences of the Huntington domain. Along the crest ran a path which had once been gravelled and trimmed. Beyond, through a thicket of laurels and rhododendrons, they came on a long unkempt isle of grass, which seemed to be one of those side avenues often found in connection with old Scots dwellings. Keeping along this they reached a grove of beech and holly through which showed a dim shape of masonry. By a common impulse they moved stealthily, crouching in cover, till at the far side of the wood they found a sunk fence and looked over an acre or two of what had once been lawn and flower beds to the front of the mansion. The outline of the building was clearly silhouetted against the glowing west, but since they were looking at the east face the detail was all in shadow. But, dim as it was, the sight was enough to give Dickson the surprise of his life. He had expected something old and baronial. But this was new, raw, and new, not 20 years built. Some madness had prompted its creator to set up a replica of a Tudor house in a countryside where the thing was unheard of. All the tricks were their oriel windows, lozenged panes, high-twisted chimney stacks. The very stone was red, as if to imitate the mellow brick of some ancient Kentish manor. It was new, but it was also decaying. The creepers had fallen from the walls, the pilasters on the terrace were tumbling down, lichen and moss were on the doorsteps. Shuttered, silent, abandoned, it stood like a harsh memento mori of human hopes. Dickson had never before been affected by an inanimate thing with so strong a sense of disquiet. He had pictured an old stone tower on a bright headland, he found instead this raw thing among trees. The decadence of the brand new repels as something against nature, and this new thing was decadent. But there was a mysterious life in it, for though not a chimney smoked, it seemed to enshrine a personality and to wear a sinister aura. He felt a lively distaste, which was almost fear. He wanted to get far away from it as fast as possible. The sun, now sinking very low, sent up rays which kindled the crests of a group of firs to the left of the front door. He had the absurd fancy that they were torches flaming before a bier. It was well that the two had moved quietly and kept in shadow. Footsteps fell on their ears, on the path which threaded the lawn just beyond the sunk fence. It was the keeper of the West Lodge and he carried something on his back, but both that and his face were indistinct in the half-light. Other footsteps were heard, coming from the other side of the lawn. A man's shod feet rang on the stone of a flagged path, and from their irregular fall it was plain that he was lame. The two men met near the door, and spoke together. Then they separated, and moved one down each side of the house. To the two watchers they had the air of a patrol, or of warders pacing the corridors of a prison. "Let's get out of this," said Dickson, and turned to go. The air had the curious stillness which precedes the moment of sunset, when the birds of day have stopped their noises and the sounds of night have not begun. But suddenly in the silence fell notes of music. They seemed to come from the house, a voice singing softly but with great beauty and clearness. Dickson halted in his steps. The tune, whatever it was like a fresh wind to blow aside his depression. The house no longer looked sepulchral. He saw that the two men had hurried back from their patrol, had met and exchanged some message, and made off again as if alarmed by the music. Then he noticed his companion. Heritage was on one knee with his face wrapped and listening. He got to his feet and appeared to be about to make for the house. Dickson caught him by the arm and dragged him into the bushes, and he followed unresistingly, like a man in a dream. They ploughed through the thicket, recrossed the grass avenue, and scrambled down the hillside to the banks of the stream. Then for the first time Dickson observed that his companion's face was very white, and that sweat stood on his temples. Heritage lay down and lapped up water like a dog. Then he turned a wild eye on the other. "I am going back," he said. "That is the voice of the girl I saw in Rome, and it is singing her song." Chapter 4. Dougal. "You'll do nothing of the kind," said Dickson. "You're coming home to your supper." It was to be on the chap of 9. "I'm going back to that place." The man was clearly demented and must be humoured. "Well, you must wait till the morn's morning. It's very near dark now, and those are two ugly customers wandering about yonder. You'd better sleep the night on it." Mr. Heritage seemed to be persuaded. He suffered himself to be led up the now dusky slopes to the gate where the road from the village ended. He walked listlessly like a man engaged in painful reflection. Once only he broke the silence. "You heard the singing?" he asked. Dickson was a very poor hand at a lie. I heard something, he admitted. You heard a girl's voice singing. It sounded like that, was the admission. But I'm thinking it might have been a seagull. You're a fool, said the poet rudely. The return was a melancholy business, compared to the bright speed of the outward journey. Dickson's mind was a chaos of feelings, all of them unpleasant. He had run up against something which he violently, blindly detested, and the trouble was that he could not tell why. It was all perfectly absurd, for why on earth should an ugly house, some overgrown trees and a couple of ill-favored servants so malignly affect him? Yet this was the fact, he had strayed out of Arcady into a sphere that filled him with revolt and a nameless fear. Never in his experience had he felt like this foolish childish panic which took all the color and zest out of life. He tried to laugh at himself but failed. Heritage, stumbling alone by his side, effectually crushed his effort to discover humor in the situation. Some exhalation from that infernal place had driven the poet mad. And then that voice singing. A seagull, he had said. More like a nightingale, he reflected, a bird which in the flesh he had never met. Mrs. Moran had the lamp lit and a fire burning in her cheerful kitchen. The sight of it somewhat restored Dickson's equanimity, and to his surprise he found that he had an appetite for supper. There was new milk, thick with cream, and most of the dainties which had appeared at tea, supplemented by a noble dish of shimmering potted head. The hostess did not share their meal, being engaged in some duties in the little cubby hole known as the back kitchen. Heritage drank a glass of milk but would not touch food. I called this place paradise 4 hours ago, he said. So it is, but I fancy it is next door to hell. There is something devilish going on inside that park wall and I mean to get to the bottom of it. Hoots. Nonsense. Dickson replied with affected cheerfulness. Tomorrow you and me will take the road for Auchenlacan. We needn't trouble ourselves about an ugly old house and a wheen impudent lodge keepers. Tomorrow I'm going to get inside the place. Don't come unless you like, but it's no use arguing with me. My mind is made up. Heritage cleared a space on the table and spread out a section of a large-scale ordnance map. I must clear my head about the topography, the same as if this were a battleground. Look here, dog son. The road past the inn that we went by tonight runs north and south. He tore a page from a notebook and proceeded to make a rough sketch. One end we know abuts on the lava glen, and the other stops at the South Lodge. Inside the wall which follows the road is a long belt of plantation, mostly beeches and ash, then to the west a kind of park, and beyond that the lawns of the house. Strips of plantation with avenues between follow the north and south sides of the park. On the seaside of the house are the stables and what looks like a walled garden, and beyond them what seems to be open ground with an old dovecot marked and the ruins of Huntington Keep. Beyond that there is more open ground, till you come to the cliffs of the Cape. Have you got that? It looks possible from the contouring to get onto the sea cliffs by following the lava, for all that side is broken up into ravines. But look at the other side, the Garple Glen. It's evidently a deep-cut gully, and at the bottom it opens out into a little harbour. There's deep water there, you observe. Now the house on the south side, the Garple side, is built fairly close to the edge of the cliffs. Is that all clear in your head? We can't reconnoitre unless we've got a working notion of the lie of the land. Dickson was about to protest that he had no intention of reconnoitring, when a hubbub arose in the back kitchen. Mrs. Moran's voice was heard in shrill protest. Ye ill laddie! Ye ill laddie! Crescendo, mark in a hash o' my back door wi your dirty feet. What are ye slinking round here for, when I tell ye this morning that I would sell ye nae mair scones till ye paid for the last lot? Ye re a ween thieving hungry call ants, and if there were a policeman in the place I'd gie ye in charge. What's that ye say? Ye re no wanting meat? Ye want to speak to the gentleman that's bidden here. Ye ken the old ane, says you? I believe it's a muckle lee, but there's the gentleman to answer ye there's else. Mrs. Moran, brandishing a dishclout dramatically, flung open the door, and with a vigorous push propelled into the kitchen a singular figure. It was a stunted boy, who from his face might have been 15 years old, but had the stature of a child of 12. He had a thatch of fiery red hair above a pale freckled countenance. His nose was snub, his eyes a sulky grey-green, and his wide mouth disclosed large and damaged teeth. But remarkable as was his visage, his clothing was still stranger. On his head was the regulation Boy Scout hat, but it was several sizes too big, and was squashed down upon his immense red ears. He wore a very ancient khaki shirt, which had once belonged to a full-grown soldier, and the spacious sleeves were rolled up at the shoulders and tied with string, revealing a pair of skinny arms. Round his middle hung what was meant to be a kilt of home manufacture, which may once have been a tablecloth, for its bold pattern suggested no known clan tartan. He had a massive belt, in which was stuck a broken gully knife, and round his neck was knotted the remnant of what had once been a silk bandana. His legs and feet were bare, blue, scratched, and very dirty, and his toes had the prehensile look common to monkeys and small boys who summer and winter go bootless. In his hand was a long ash pole, new cut from some coppice. The apparition stood glum and lowering on the kitchen floor. As Dickson stared at it he recalled Mearn Street and the band of irregular Boy Scouts who paraded to the roll of tin cans. Before him stood Dougal, chieftain of the Gorbals Die Hards. Suddenly he remembered the philanthropic Mackintosh, and his own subscription of £10 to the camp fund. It pleased him to find the rascals here, for in the unpleasant affairs on the verge of which he felt himself they were a comforting reminder of the peace of home. "I'm glad to see you, Dougal," he said pleasantly. "How are you all getting on? And then, with a vague reminiscence of the Scouts' code, have you been minding to perform a good deed every day?" The chieftain's brow darkened. "Good deeds," he repeated bitterly. "I tell ye I'm fair wore out wi good deeds. Yon man Mackintosh tell't me this was going to be a grand holiday." "Holiday? Govy Dick. It's been like a Saturday night in Main Street affectin'. No collocation of letters could reproduce Dougal's accent, and I will not attempt it. There was a touch of Irish in it, a spice of music, hall patter, as well as the odd lilt of the Glasgow vernacular. He was strong in vowels, but the consonants, especially the letter T, were only aspirations. "Sit down and let's hear about things," said Dickson. The boy turned his head to the still open back door, where Mrs. Moran could be heard at her labours. He stepped across and shut it. "I'm no wanting that old wife to hear," he said. Then he squatted down on the patchwork rug by the hearth, and warmed his blue-black shins. Looking into the glow of the fire, he observed, "I seen you two up by the big Who's the Night." "The devil you did," said Heritage, roused to a sudden attention. "And where were you?" 7 feet from your head, up a tree. It's my chief hidey hole, and gosh! I need one, Phil leans after me wi a gun. He got a shot at me 2 days syne. Dickson exclaimed, and Dougal with morose pride showed a rent in his kilt. "If I had on breeks, he'd ha' got me." "Who's lean?" Heritage asked. "The man wi the black coat. The other, the lame one, they see a spital." "How do you know?" "I've listened to them crackin' thegither." "But what for did the man want to shoot at you?" asked the scandalized Dickson. "What for?" "Because they're frightened to death o' anybody going near their old Who's. They're a pair of devils, worse nor any Red Indian, but for that they're sweatin' wi fright." "What for?" says you. "Because they're hidden a secret. I knew it as soon as I seen the man lean's face. I once seen the same kind o' scoundrel at the Pictus. When he opened his mouth to swear, I kenned he was a foreigner, like the lads down at the Broomilaw. That looked black, but I hadn't got at the worst of it. Then he loosed off at me his gun. Were you not feared? Said Dickson. I was feared. But you'll no choke off the gaubles die hearts gun. We held a meeting round the campfire, and we resolved to get to the bottom o' the business. Me being their chief, it was my duty to make what they see a reconnaissance, for that was the dangerous job. So this day I've been going on my belly about they policies. I've found out some queer things. Heritage had risen and was staring down at the small squatting figure. What have you found out? Quick. Tell me at once. His voice was sharp and excited. Bide a wee, said the unwinking Dougal. I'm no going to let ye into this business till I ken that you'll help. It's a far bigger job than I thought. There's more in it than lean and spittal. There's the big man that keeps the public, Dobson, they see him. He's a name recon, which looks bad. And there's 2-3 tinklers camping down in the Garpledine. They're in it, for Dobson was colloguing them a morning. When I seen ye, I thought ye were more o' the gang, till I mind it that one o' ye was Auld McCunn that has the shop in Mearn Street. I seen that ye didn't like the look o' lean, and I followed ye here, for I was thinking I needed help. Heritage plucked Dougal by the shoulder and lifted him to his feet. For God's sake, boy, he cried, tell us what you know. Will ye help? Of course, you little fool. Then swear, said the ritualist. From a grimy wallet he extracted a limp little volume which proved to be a damaged copy of a work entitled Sacred Songs and Solos. Here. Take that in your right hand and put your left hand on my pole, and say after me, I swear no to blab what is telled me in secret and to be swift and sure in obeying orders, help me God. Sign Kiss the Bookie. Dickson at first refused, declaring it was all Havers, but Heritage's docility persuaded him to follow suit. The two were sworn. Now, said Heritage. Dougal squatted again on the hearth rug, and gathered the eyes of his audience. He was enjoying himself. This day, he said slowly, I got inside the Who's. Stout fellow, said Heritage, and what did you find there? I got inside that Who's, but it wasn't once or twice I tried. I found a corner where I was out o' sight o' anybody unless they had come there seeking me, and I sklimmed up a roan pipe, but the windies were locket and I very near broke my neck. Sign I tried the roof, and a sore sklim I had, but when I got there were no skylights. At the end I got in by the coal hole. That's why ye may be thinking I'm no very clean. Heritage's patience was nearly exhausted. I don't want to hear how you got in. What did you find, you little devil? Inside the Who's, said Dougal slowly, and there was a melancholy sense of anti-climax in his voice, as of one who had hoped to speak of gold and jewels and armed men. Inside that Who's there's nothing but 2 women. Heritage sat down before him with a stern face. Describe them, he commanded. One o' them is dead old as the wife here. She didn't look to me very right in the head. And the other? Oh, just a lassie. What was she like? Dougal seemed to be searching for adequate words. She is. He began. Then a popular song gave him inspiration. She's pure as the lily in the dell. In no way discomposed by Heritage's fierce interrogatory air, he continued, she's either foreign or English, for she couldn't understand what I said, and I could make nothing o' her clip-pit tongue. But I could see she had been greetin'. She looked feared, yet kind o' determined. I spid if I could do anything for her, and when she got my meaning she was terrible anxious to ken if I had seen a big man, she said, Yellowbeard. She didn't seem to ken his name, or else she wouldn't tell me. The old wife was mortal feared, and was I speaking in a foreign language. I seen at once that what frightened them was Lean and his friends, and I was just starting to spee about them when there came a sound like a man walking along the passage. She was for hidden me in behind a soffy, but I wasn't going to be trapped like that, so I got out by the other door and down the kitchen stairs and into the coal hole. Gosh, it was a near thing. The boy was on his feet. I must be off to the camp to give out the orders for the morn. I'm going back to that hoose, for it's a fight atween the gawbles die-hards and the scoundrels that are frightening they women. The question is, are ye coming with me? Mind, ye sworn. But if ye know, I'm going missile, though I'll no deny I'd be glad o' company. You anyway, he added, nodding at Heritage. Maybe old McCunn wouldn't get through the coal hole. You're an impudent laddie, said the outraged Dickson. It's no likely we're coming with you. Breaking into other folks' houses. It's a job for the police. Please yes'll, said the chieftain and looked at Heritage. I'm on, said that gentleman. Well, just you set out the morn as if you were for a walk up the Garple Glen. I'll be on the road and I'll have orders for ye. Without more ado Dougal left by way of the back kitchen. There was a brief denunciation from Mrs. Moran, then the outer door banged and he was gone. The poet sat still with his head in his hands, while Dickson, acutely uneasy, prowled about the floor. He had forgotten even to light his pipe. You'll not be thinking of heeding that ragamuffin boy, he ventured. I'm certainly going to get into the house tomorrow, Heritage answered, and if he can show me a way so much the better. He's a spirited youth. Do you breed many like him in Glasgow? Plenty, said Dickson sourly. See here, Mr. Heritage. You can't expect me to be going about burgling houses on the word of a blackguard laddie. I'm a respectable man I been. Besides, I'm here for a holiday, and I've no call to be mixing myself up in strangers' affairs. You haven't. Only, you see, I think there's a friend of mine in that place, and anyhow there are women in trouble. If you like, we'll say good-bye after breakfast, and you can continue as if you had never turned aside to this damned peninsula. But I've got to stay. Dickson groaned. What had become of his dream of ideals, his gentle bookish romance? Vanished before a reality which smacked horribly of crude melodrama and possibly of sordid crime. His gorge rose at the picture, but a thought troubled him. Perhaps all romance in its hour of happening was rough and ugly like this, and only shone rosy in the retrospect. Was he being false to his deepest faith? Let's have Mrs. Moran in, he ventured. She's a wise old body and I'd like to hear her opinion of this business. We'll get common sense from her. I don't object, said Heritage. But no amount of common sense will change my mind. Their hostess forestalled them by returning at that moment to the kitchen. We want your advice, mistress, Dickson told her, and accordingly, like a barrister with a client, she seated herself carefully in the big easy chair, found and adjusted her spectacles, and waited with hands folded on her lap to hear the business. Dickson narrated their pre-supper doings, and gave a sketch of Dougal's evidence. His exposition was cautious and colourless, and without conviction. He seemed to expect a robust incredulity in his hearer. Mrs. Moran listened with the gravity of one in church. When Dickson finished she seemed to meditate. There's no blackguard trick that would surprise me in they new folk. What's that ye see them lean and spit how? Eppy home 3-pit to me they were foreigners and these are no foreign names. What I want to hear from you, Mrs. Moran, said Dickson impressively, is whether you think there's anything in that boy's story. I think it's most likely true. He's a terrible impudent callant, but he's no a leer. Then you think that a gang of ruffians have got 2 lone women shut up in that house for their own purposes? I would no wonder. But it's ridiculous. This is a Christian and law-abiding country. What would the police say? They never troubled Dalkhotter muckle. There's no a policeman nearer than Knockraw yin Johnny Trumley, and he's as useless as a frosted tap-tie. The wise-like thing, as I think, said Dickson, would be to turn the procurator fiscal onto the job. It's his business, no ours. Will, I wouldna say but ye riched, said the lady. What would you do if you were us? Dickson's tone was subtly confidential. My friend here wants to get into the house the morn with that red-haired laddie to satisfy himself about the facts. I say no. Let sleeping dogs lie, I say, and if you think the beasts are mad, report to the authorities. What would you do yourself? If I were you, came the emphatic reply, I would tak the first train hame the morn, and when I got hame I would bide there. Ye're a decent body, but ye're no the kind to be travel in the roads. And if you were me? Heritage asked with his queer crooked smile. If I was a young and old like you I would gang into the hoose, and I wouldna rest till I had riddled out the truth and jiled every scoundrel about the place. If ye dinna gang, faith I'll kilt my coats and gang missile. I have e'en served the Kennedys for 40 year no to ha the honour o' the hoose at my heart. Ye spid my advice, sirs, and ye've gotten it. Now I maun clear away your supper. Dickson asked for a candle, and, as on the previous night, went abruptly to bed. The oracle of prudence to which he had appealed had betrayed him and counselled folly. But was it folly? For him, assuredly, for Dickson McCunn, late of Man Street, Glasgow, wholesale and retail provision merchant, elder in the Guthrie Memorial Kirk, and 55 years of age. That was the rub. He was getting old. The woman had seen it and had advised him to go home. Yet the plea was curiously irksome, though it gave him the excuse he needed. If you played at being young, you had to take up the obligations of youth, and he thought derisively of his boyish exhilaration of the past days. Derisively, but also sadly. What had become of that innocent joviality he had dreamed of, that happy morning pilgrimage of spring enlivened by tags from the poets? His goddess had played him false. Romance had put upon him too hard a trial. He lay long awake, torn between common sense and a desire to be loyal to some vague whimsical standard. Heritage a yard distant appeared also to be sleepless, for the bed creaked with his turning. Dickson found himself envying one whose troubles, whatever they might be, were not those of a divided mind. Chapter 5. Of the Princess in the Tower. Very early next morning, while Mrs. Moran was still cooking breakfast, Dickson and Heritage might have been observed taking the air in the village street. It was the poet who had insisted upon this walk, and he had his own purpose. They looked at the spires of smoke piercing the windless air, and studied the daffodils in the cottage gardens. Dickson was glum, but Heritage seemed in high spirits. He varied his garrulity with spells of cheerful whistling. They strode along the road by the park wall till they reached the inn. Their Heritage's music waxed peculiarly loud. Presently from the yard, unshaven and looking as if he had slept in his clothes, came Dobson the innkeeper. "Good morning," said the poet. "I hope the sickness in your house is on the mend." "Thank ye, it's no worse," was the reply, but in the man's heavy face there was little civility. His small grey eyes searched their faces. "We're just waiting on breakfast to get on the road again. I'm jolly glad we spent the night here. We found quarters after all, you know." "So I see. Whereabouts, may I ask?" "Mrs. Moran's. We could always have got in there, but we didn't want to fuss an old lady, so we thought we'd try the inn first. She's my friend's aunt." At this amazing facade Dickson started, and the man observed his surprise. The eyes were turned on him like a searchlight. They roused antagonism in his peaceful soul, and with that antagonism came an impulse to back up the poet. He said, "she's my Auntie Femi, my mother's half-sister." The man turned on Heritage. "Where are ye for the day?" "Or Kenlucan," said Dickson hastily. He was still determined to shake the dust of Dalcarter from his feet. The innkeeper sensibly brightened. "Well, you'll have a fine walk. I must go in and see about my own breakfast. Good day to ye, gentleman. That, said Heritage as they entered the village street again, is the first step in camouflage, to put the enemy off his guard. It was an abominable lie, said Dickson crossly. Not at all. It was a necessary and proper ruse, Digger. It explained why we spent the night here, and now Dobson and his friends can get about their day's work with an easy mind. Their suspicions are temporarily allayed, and that will make our job easier. I'm not coming with you. I never said you were. By we I refer to myself and the red-headed boy. Mistress, you're my auntie, Dickson informed Mrs. Moran as she set the porridge on the table. This gentleman has just been telling the man at the inn that you're my Auntie Femi. For a second their hostess looked bewildered. Then the corners of her prim mouth moved upwards in a slow smile. I see, she said. Will, maybe it was well done. But if ye re my never you'll ha' to keep up my credit, for we're a bald and sick car lot. Half an hour later there was a furious dissension when Dickson attempted to pay for the night's entertainment. Mrs. Moran would have none of it. Ye re know why yet, she said tartly, and the matter was complicated by Heritage's refusal to take part in the debate. He stood aside and grinned, till Dickson in despair returned his note case to his pocket, murmuring darkly that he would send it from Glasgow. The road to Auchenlacan left the main village street at right angles by the side of Mrs. Moran's cottage. It was a better road than that which they had come yesterday, for by it twice daily the post cart travelled to the post town. It ran on the edge of the moor and on the lip of the Garple Glen, till it crossed that stream and, keeping near the coast, emerged after 5 miles into the cultivated flats of the Locan Valley. The morning was fine, the keen air invited to high spirits, plovers piped entrancingly over the bent and linnets sang in the winds, there was a solid breakfast behind him, and the promise of a cheerful road till luncheon. The stage was set for good humour, but Dickson's heart, which should have been ascending with the larks, stuck leadenly in his boots. He was not even relieved at putting Dalcarter behind him. The atmosphere of that unhallowed place lay still on his soul. He hated it, but he hated himself more. Here was one, who had hugged himself all his days as an adventurer waiting his chance, running away at the first challenge of adventure, a lover of romance who fled from the earliest overture of his goddess. He was ashamed and angry, but what else was there to do? Burglary in the company of a queer poet and a queerer urchin? It was unthinkable. Presently as they tramped silently on they came to the bridge beneath which the peaty waters of the Garple ran in porter, coloured pools and tawny cascades. From a clump of elders on the other side Dougal emerged. A barefoot boy, dressed in much the same parody of a Boy Scout's uniform, but with corduroy shorts instead of a kilt, stood before him at rigid attention. Some command was issued, the child saluted, and trotted back past the travellers with never a look at them. Discipline was strong among the Gorbals die-hards, no chief of staff ever conversed with his general under a stricter etiquette. Dougal received the travellers with the condescension of a regular towards civilians. They're off their gourd, he announced. Thomas Yanai has been shadowing them since Scray O'Day, and he reports that Dobson and Lean followed ye till ye were out o' sight o' the houses, and syne Lean got a spy glass and watched ye till the road turned in among the trees. That satisfied them, and they are both away back to their jobs. Thomas Yaunai's the fell yin. Ye'll know fickle Thomas Yanai. Dougal extricated from his pouch the fag of a cigarette, lit it and puffed meditatively. I did a reconnaissance missile this morning. I was up at the house afore it was light, and tried the door o' the coal hole. I doot they've gotten on our tracks, for it was lockit and wedged from the inside. Dickson brightened. Was the insane venture off? For a wee bit I was fair beat. But I mind it that the lassie was allowed to walk in a kind o' a glass who's on the side farthest away from the Garple. That was where she was singeing yestreen. So I reconnaissanced in that direction, and I found a queer place. Sacred songs and solos was requisitioned, and on a page of it Dougal proceeded to make marks with the stump of a carpenter's pencil. "See here," he commanded. "There's the glass place a door into the house. That door must be open or the lassie must have the key, for she comes there whenever she likes. Now, at each end o' the place the doors are locked, but the front that looks on the garden is open, muckle posts and flower pots. The trouble is that side there's maybe 20 feet o' a wall between the parapet and the ground. It's an old wall cracks and holes in it, and it wouldn't be ill to sklim. That's why they let her gang there when she wants, for a lassie couldn't get away without breaking her neck." "Could we climb it?" Heritage asked. The boy wrinkled his brows. "I could manage it, missile, I think, and maybe you. I doubt if old McCunn could get up. Ye'd have to be mighty careful that nobody saw ye, for your hinder end, as ye were sklimmin', would be a grand mark for a gun." "Lead on," said Heritage. "We'll try the veranda." They both looked at Dickson, and Dickson, scarlet in the face, looked back at them. He had suddenly found the thought of a solitary march to Auchenlacan intolerable. Once again he was at the parting of the ways, and once more caprice determined his decision. That the coal hole was out of the question had worked a change in his views. Somehow it seemed to him less burglarious to enter by a veranda. He felt very frightened but, for the moment, quite resolute. "I'm coming with you," he said. "Sportsman," said Heritage and held out his hand. "Well done, the old yin," said the chieftain of the Gorbals diehards. Dickson's quaking heart experienced a momentary bound as he followed Heritage down the track into the Garpaldine. The track wound through a thick covert of hazels, now close to the rushing water, now high upon the bank so that clear sky showed through the fringes of the wood. When they had gone a little way Dougal halted them. "It's a ticklish job," he whispered. "There's the tinklers, mind, that's camping in the Dean. If they're still in their camp we can get by easy enough, but they may be wandering about the wood after rabbits. Then we must ford the water, for you'll no cross it lower down where it's deep. Our road is on the who side o' the Dean and it's awfu' public if there's onybody on the other side, though it's hid well enough from folk up in the policies. Ye must do exactly what I tell ye. When we get near danger I'll scout on ahead, and I adore ye to move a hair o' your head till I give the word." Presently, when they were at the edge of the water, Dougal announced his intention of crossing. 3 boulders in the stream made a bridge for an active man and Heritage hopped lightly over. Not so Dickson, who stuck fast on the second stone, and would certainly have fallen in had not Dougal plunged into the current and steadied him with a grimy hand. The leap was at last successfully taken, and the 3 scrambled up a rough score, all reddened with iron springs, till they struck a slender track running down the Dean on its northern side. Here the undergrowth was very thick, and they had gone the better part of half a mile before the covert thinned sufficiently to show them the stream beneath. Then Dougal halted them with a finger on his lips, and crept forward alone. He returned in 3 minutes. "Coast's clear," he whispered. "The tinklers are eating their breakfast. They are late at their meat though they're up early seeking it." Progress was now very slow and secret and mainly on all fours. At one point Dougal nodded downward, and the other 2 saw on a patch of turf, where the Garpal began to widen into its estuary, a group of figures round a small fire. There were 4 of them, all men, and Dickson thought he had never seen such ruffianly-looking customers. After that they moved high up the slope, in a shallow glade of a tributary burn, till they came out of the trees and found themselves looking seaward. On one side was the house, 100 yards or so back from the edge, the roof showing above the precipitous scarp. Half-way down the slope became easier, a jumble of boulders and boiler plates, till it reached the waters of the small haven, which lay calm as a mill pond in the windless forenoon. The haven broadened out at its foot and revealed a segment of blue sea. The opposite shore was flatter and showed what looked like an old wharf and the ruins of buildings, behind which rose a bank clad with scrub and surmounted by some gnarled and wind-crooked firs. "There's dashed little cover here," said Heritage. "There's no muckle," Dougal assented. But they canna see us from the policies, and it's no like there's anybody watching from the who's. The danger is somebody on the other side, but we'll have to risk it. Once among they big stones we're safe. Are you ready? 5 minutes later Dickson found himself gasping in the lee of a boulder, while Dougal was making a cast forward. The scout returned with a hopeful report. I think we're safe, till we get into the policies. There's a road that the old folk made when ships used to come here. Down there it's deeper than Clyde at the Broomielaw. Has the old yin got his wind yet? There's no time to waste. Up that broken hillside they crawled, well in the cover of the tumbled stones, till they reached a low wall which was the boundary of the garden. The house was now behind them on their right rear, and as they topped the crest they had a glimpse of an ancient dovecot and the ruins of the old Huntington on the short thymy turf which ran seaward to the cliffs. Dougal led them along a sunk fence which divided the downs from the lawns behind the house, and, avoiding the stables, brought them by devious ways to a thicket of rhododendrons and broom. On all fours they travelled the length of the place, and came to the edge where some forgotten gardeners had once tended a herbaceous border. The border was now rank and wild, and, lying flat under the shade of an azalea, and peering through the young spears of iris, Dickson and Heritage regarded the north-western facade of the house. The ground before them had been a sunken garden, from which a steep wall, once covered with creepers and rock plants, rose to a long veranda, which was pillared and open on that side, but at each end built up half-way and glazed for the rest. There was a glass roof, and inside untended shrubs sprawled in broken plaster vases. "Ye must bide here," said Dougal, "and no cheep above your breath. Afore we dare to try that wall, I must ken where Lean and Spittal and Dobson are. I'm off to spy the policies." He glided out of sight behind a clump of pampas grass. For hours, so it seemed, Dickson was left to his own unpleasant reflections. His body, prone on the moist earth, was fairly comfortable, but his mind was ill at ease. The scramble up the hillside had convinced him that he was growing old, and there was no rebound in his soul to counter the conviction. He felt listless, spiritless and apathy with fright trembling somewhere at the back of it. He regarded the veranda wall with foreboding. How on earth could he climb that? And if he did there would be his exposed hinder parts inviting a shot from some malevolent gentleman among the trees. He reflected that he would give a large sum of money to be out of this preposterous adventure. Heritage's hand was stretched towards him, containing 2 of Mrs. Moran's jellied scones, of which the poet had been wise enough to bring a supply in his pocket. The food cheered him, for he was growing very hungry, and he began to take an interest in the scene before him instead of his own thoughts. He observed every detail of the veranda. There was a door at one end, he noted, giving on a path which wound down to the sunk garden. As he looked he heard a sound of steps and saw a man ascending this path. It was the lame man whom Dougal had called Spittal, the dweller in the South Lodge. Seen at closer quarters he was an odd-looking being, lean as a heron, right-necked, but amazingly quick on his feet. Had not Mrs. Moran said that he hobbled as fast as other folk ran? He kept his eyes on the ground and seemed to be talking to himself as he went, but he was alert enough, for the dropping of a twig from a dying magnolia transferred him in an instant into a figure of active vigilance. No risks could be run with that watcher. He took a key from his pocket, opened the garden door and entered the veranda. For a moment his shuffle sounded on its tiled floor, and then he entered the door admitting from the veranda to the house. It was clearly unlocked for there came no sound of a turning key. Dickson had finished the last crumbs of his scones before the man emerged again. He seemed to be in a greater hurry than ever, as he locked the garden door behind him and hobbled along the west front of the house till he was lost to sight. After that the time passed slowly. A pair of yellow wagtails arrived and played at hide and seek among the stuccoed pillars. The little dry scratch of their claws was heard clearly in the still air. Dickson had almost fallen asleep when a smothered exclamation from Heritage woke him to attention. A girl had appeared in the veranda. Above the parapet he saw only her body from the waist up. She seemed to be clad in bright colors, for something red was round her shoulders and her hair was bound with an orange scarf. She was tall, that he could tell, tall and slim and very young. Her face was turned seaward, and she stood for a little scanning the broad channel, shading her eyes as if to search for something on the extreme horizon. The air was very quiet and he thought that he could hear her sigh. Then she turned and re-entered the house, while Heritage by his side began to curse under his breath with a shocking fervor. One of Dickson's troubles had been that he did not really believe Dougal's story, and the sight of the girl removed one doubt. That bright exotic thing did not belong to the Cruives or to Scotland at all, and that she should be in the house removed the place from the conventional dwelling to which the laws against burglary applied. There was a rustle among the rhododendrons and the fiery face of Dougal appeared. He lay between the other two, his chin on his hands, and grunted out his report. After they had their dinner Dobson and Lean yoked a horse and went off to Auchenlacan. I seen them pass the Garple brig, so that's 2 accounted for. Has Spittal been round here? Half an hour ago, said Heritage, consulting a wristwatch. It was him that keepit me waiting so long. But he's safe enough now, for 5 minutes syne he was splittin' firewood at the back door o' his hoose. I've found a ladder, an old yin in a hint yon lot o' bushes. It'll help wi the wall. There. I've gotten my breath again and we can start. The ladder was fetched by Heritage and proved to be ancient and wanting many rungs, but sufficient in length. The three stood silent for a moment, listening like stags, and then ran across the intervening lawn to the foot of the veranda wall. Dougal went up first, then Heritage, and lastly Dickson, stiff and giddy from his long lie under the bushes. Below the parapet the veranda floor was heaped with old garden litter, rotten matting, dead or derelict bulbs, fibre, withies, and strawberry nets. It was Dougal's intention to pull up the ladder and hide it among the rubbish against the hour of departure. But Dickson had barely put his foot on the parapet when there was a sound of steps within the house approaching the veranda door. The ladder was left alone. Dougal's hand brought Dickson summarily to the floor, where he was fairly well concealed by a mess of matting. Unfortunately his head was in the vicinity of some upturned pot plants, so that a cactus ticked his brow and a spike of aloe supported painfully the back of his neck. Heritage was prone behind 2 old water butts, and Dougal was in a hamper which had once contained seed potatoes. The house door had panels of opaque glass, so the newcomer could not see the doings of the three till it was opened, and by that time all were in cover. The man, it was Spittal, walked rapidly along the veranda and out of the garden door. He was talking to himself again, and Dickson, who had a glimpse of his face, thought he looked both evil and furious. Then came some anxious moments, for had the man glanced back when he was once outside, he must have seen the tell-tale ladder. But he seemed immersed in his own reflections, for he hobbled steadily along the house front till he was lost to sight. "That'll be the end o' them the night," said Dougal, as he helped Heritage to pull up the ladder and stow it away. "We've got the place to ourselves, now. Forward, men, forward." He tried the handle of the house door and led the way in. A narrow paved passage took them into what had once been the garden room, where the lady of the house had arranged her flowers, and the tennis rackets and croquet mallets had been kept. It was very dusty and on the cobwebbed walls still hung a few soiled garden overalls. A door beyond opened into a huge murky hall, murky, for the windows were shuttered, and the only light came through things like port-holes far up in the wall. Dougal, who seemed to know his way about, halted them. "Stop here till I scout a bit. The women bide in a wee room through that muckle door." Bare feet stole across the oak flooring, there was the sound of a door swinging on its hinges, and then silence and darkness. Dickson put out a hand for companionship and clutched Heritage's. To his surprise it was cold and all a tremble. They listened for voices, and thought they could detect a far-away sob. It was some minutes before Dougal returned. "A bonny kettle o' fish," he whispered. "They're both greetin'. We're just in time. Come on, the pair o' ye. Through a green baize door they entered a passage which led to the kitchen regions, and turned in at the first door on their right. From its situation Dickson calculated that the room lay on the seaward side of the house next to the veranda. The light was bad, for the 2 windows were partially shuttered, but it had plainly been a smoking room, for there were pipe racks by the hearth, and on the walls a number of old school and college photographs, a couple of oars with emblazoned names, and a variety of stags and roebucks' heads. There was no fire in the grate, but a small oil stove burned inside the fender. In a stiff-backed chair sat an elderly woman, who seemed to feel the cold, for she was muffled to the neck in a fur coat. Beside her, so that the late afternoon light caught her face and head, stood a girl. Dickson's first impression was of a tall child. The pose, startled and wild and yet curiously stiff and self-conscious, was that of a child striving to remember a forgotten lesson. One hand clutched a handkerchief, the other was closing and unclosing on a knob of the chair back. She was staring at Dougal, who stood like a gnome in the center of the floor. "Here's the gentleman I was telling ye about," was his introduction, but her eyes did not move. Then Heritage stepped forward. "We have met before, mademoiselle," he said. "Do you remember Easter in 1918, in the house in the Trinité Monte?" The girl looked at him. "I do not remember," she said slowly. "But I was the English officer who had the apartments on the floor below you. I saw you every morning. You spoke to me sometimes." "You are a soldier?" she asked, with a new note in her voice. "I was then, till the war finished." "And now? Why have you come here?" "To offer you help if you need it. If not, to ask your pardon and go away." The shrouded figure in the chair burst suddenly into rapid hysterical talk in some foreign tongue which Dickson suspected of being French. Heritage replied in the same language, and the girl joined in with sharp questions. Then the poet turned to Dickson. "This is my friend. If you will trust us we will do our best to save you." The eyes rested on Dickson's face, and he realized that he was in the presence of something the like of which he had never met in his life before. It was a loveliness greater than he had imagined was permitted by the Almighty to his creatures. The little face was more square than oval, with a low broad brow and proud exquisite eyebrows. The eyes were of a color which he could never decide on. Afterwards he used to allege obscurely that they were the color of everything in spring. There was a delicate pallor in the cheeks, and the face bore signs of suffering and care, possibly even of hunger, but for all that there was youth there, eternal and triumphant. Not youth such as he had known it, but youth with all history behind it, youth with centuries of command in its blood and the world's treasures of beauty and pride in its ancestry. Strange, he thought, that a thing so fine should be so masterful. He felt abashed in every inch of him. As the eyes rested on him their sorrowfulness seemed to be shot with humor. A ghost of a smile lurked there, to which Dickson promptly responded. He grinned and bowed. "Very pleased to meet you, Mem. I'm Mr. McCunn from Glasgow." "You don't even know my name," she said. "We don't," said Heritage. "They call me Saskia. This," nodding to the chair, "is my cousin Eugenie. We are in very great trouble. But why should I tell you? I do not know you. You cannot help me." "We can try," said Heritage. "Part of your trouble we know already through that boy. You are imprisoned in this place by scoundrels. We are here to help you to get out. We want to ask no questions, only to do what you bid us." "You are not strong enough," she said sadly. "A young man, an old man, and a little boy. There are many against us, and any moment there may be more." It was Dougal's turn to break in. "There's Lean and Spittal and Dobson and 4 tinklers in the Dean, that's 7, but there's us 3 and 5 more Gaubles die hards, that's 8. There was something in the boy's truculent courage that cheered her. "I wonder," she said, and her eyes fell on each in turn. Dickson felt impelled to intervene. I think this is a perfectly simple business. Here's a lady shut up in this house against her will by a ween blackguards. This is a free country and the law doesn't permit that. My advice is for one of us to inform the police at Auchenlacan and get Dobson and his friends took up and the lady set free to do what she likes. That is, if these folks are really molesting her, which is not yet quite clear to my mind. Alas! It is not so simple as that, she said. I dare not invoke your English law, for perhaps in the eyes of that law I am a thief. Dearie me, that's a bad business, said the startled Dickson. The two women talked together in some strange tongue, and the elder appeared to be pleading and the younger objecting. Then Saskia seemed to come to a decision. I will tell you all, and she looked straight at Heritage. I do not think you would be cruel or false, for you have honorable faces. Listen, then. I am a Russian and for 2 years have been in exile. I will not speak of my house, for it is no more, or how I escaped, for it is the common tale of all of us. I have seen things more terrible than any dream and yet lived, but I have paid a price for such experience. First I went to Italy where there were friends, and I wished only to have peace among kindly people. About poverty I do not care, for, to us, who have lost all the great things, the want of bread is a little matter. But peace was forbidden me, for I learned that we Russians had to win back our fatherland again and that the weakest must work in that cause. So I was set my task and it was very hard. There were jewels which once belonged to my emperor, they had been stolen by the brigands and must be recovered. There were others still hidden in Russia which must be brought to a safe place. In that work I was ordered to share. She spoke in almost perfect English, with a certain foreign precision. Suddenly she changed to French, and talked rapidly to Heritage. She has told me about her family, he said, turning to Dickson. It is among the greatest in Russia, the very greatest after the throne. Dickson could only stare. Our enemies soon discovered me, she went on. Oh, but they are very clever, these enemies, and they have all the criminals of the world to aid them. Here you do not understand what they are. You good people in England think they are well-meaning dreamers who are forced into violence by the persecution of Western Europe. But you are wrong. Some honest fools there are among them, but the true power lies with madmen and degenerates, and they have for allies the special devil that dwells in each country. That is why they cast their net as wide as mankind. She shivered, and for a second her face wore a look which Dickson never forgot, the look of one who has looked over the edge of life into the outer dark. There were certain jewels of great price which were about to be turned into guns and armies for our enemies. These our people recovered and the charge of them was laid on me. Who would suspect, they said, a foolish girl? But our enemies were very clever, and soon the hunt was cried against me. They tried to rob me of them, but they failed, for I too had become clever. Then they asked the help of the law, first in Italy and then in France. Oh, it was subtly done. Respectable bourgeois, who hated the Bolsheviki but had bought long ago the bonds of my country, desired to be repaid their debts out of the property of the Russian crown which might be found in the West. But behind them were the Jews, and behind the Jews our unsleeping enemies. Once I was enmeshed in the law I would be safe for them, and presently they would find the hiding place of the treasure, and while the bourgeois were clamoring in the courts, it would be safe in their pockets. So I fled. For months I have been fleeing and hiding. They have tried to kidnap me many times, and once they have tried to kill me, but I, too, have become very clever, oh, very clever. And I have learned not to fear. This simple recital affected Dickson's honest soul with the liveliest indignation. Such doings, he exclaimed, and he could not forbear from whispering to Heritage an extract from that gentleman's conversation the first night at Kirkmichael. We needn't imitate all their methods, but they've got hold of the right end of the stick. They seek truth and reality. The reply from the poet was an angry shrug. Why and how did you come here? He asked. I always meant to come to England, for I thought it the sanest place in a mad world. Also it is a good country to hide in, for it is apart from Europe, and your police, as I thought, do not permit evil men to be their own law. But especially I had a friend, a Scottish gentleman, whom I knew in the days when we Russians were still a nation. I saw him again in Italy, and since he was kind and brave I told him some part of my troubles. He was called Quentin Kennedy, and now he is dead. He told me that in Scotland he had a lonely chateau where I could hide secretly and safely, and against the day when I might be hard pressed he gave me a letter to his steward, bidding him welcome me as a guest when I made application. At that time I did not think I would need such sanctuary, but a month ago the need became urgent, for the hunt in France was very close on me. So I sent a message to the steward as Captain Kennedy told me. "What is his name?" Heritage asked. She spelt it, Monsieur Loudon Loudon in the town of Auchenlecan. "The factor," said Dickson. "And what then?" "Some spy must have found me out. I had a letter from this Loudon bidding me come to Auchenlecan. There I found no steward to receive me, but another letter saying that that night a carriage would be in waiting to bring me here. It was midnight when we arrived, and we were brought in by strange ways to this house, with no light but a single candle. Here we were welcomed indeed, but by an enemy." "Which?" asked Heritage. "Dobson or Lean or Spittal?" "Dobson I do not know. Leon was there. He is no Russian, but a Belgian who was a valet in my father's service till he joined the Bolsheviki. Next day the Letspidel came, and I knew that I was in very truth entrapped. For of all our enemies he is, save one, the most subtle and unwearied." Her voice had trailed off into flat weariness. Again Dickson was reminded of a child, for her arms hung limp by her side, and her slim figure in its odd clothes was curiously like that of a boy in a school blazer. Another resemblance perplexed him. She had a hint of Janet about the mouth, Janet, that solemn little girl those 20 years in her grave. Heritage was wrinkling his brows. "I don't think I quite understand. The jewels. You have them with you?" She nodded. "These men wanted to rob you. Why didn't they do it between here and Auchenlecan? You had no chance to hide them on the journey. Why did they let you come here where you were in a better position to baffle them?" She shook her head. "I cannot explain except perhaps that Spidel had not arrived that night, and Leon may have been waiting instructions." The other still looked dissatisfied. "They are either clumsier villains than I take them to be, or there is something deeper in the business than we understand. These jewels, are they here?" His tone was so sharp that she looked startled, almost suspicious. Then she saw that in his face which reassured her. "I have them hidden here. I have grown very skillful in hiding things." "Have they searched for them?" "The first day they demanded them of me. I denied all knowledge. Then they ransacked this house. I think they ransack it daily, but I am too clever for them. I am not allowed to go beyond the veranda, and when at first I disobeyed there was always one of them in wait to force me back with a pistol behind my head. Every morning Leon brings us food for the day, good food, but not enough, so that Cousin Eugenie is always hungry, and each day he and Spidel question and threaten me. This afternoon Spidel has told me that their patience is at an end. He has given me till tomorrow at noon to produce the jewels. If not, he says I will die." "Mercy on us!" Dickson exclaimed. "There will be no mercy for us," she said solemnly. "He and his kind think as little of shedding blood as of spilling water. But I do not think he will kill me. I think I will kill him first, but after that I shall surely die. As for Cousin Eugenie, I do not know." Her level matter of fact tone seemed to Dickson most shocking, for he could not treat it as mere melodrama. It carried a horrid conviction. "We must get you out of this at once," he declared. "I cannot leave. I will tell you why. When I came to this country I appointed one to meet me here. He is a kinsman who knows England well, for he fought in your army. With him by my side I have no fear. It is altogether needful that I wait for him. Then there is something more which you haven't told us? Heritage asked. Was there the faintest shadow of a blush on her cheek? There is something more, she said. She spoke to Heritage in French and Dickson caught the name Alexis and a word which sounded like prance. The poet listened eagerly and nodded. I have heard of him, he said. But have you not seen him? A tall man with a yellow beard, who bears himself proudly. Being of my mother's race he has eyes like mine. That's the man she was asking me about yesterday, said Dougal, who had squatted on the floor. Heritage shook his head. We only came here last night. When did you expect Prince, your friend? I hope to find him here before me. Oh, it is his not coming that terrifies me. I must wait and hope. But if he does not come in time another may come before him. The ones already here are not all the enemies that threaten you. Indeed, no. The worst has still to come. Until I know he is here I do not greatly fear Spidel or Leon. They receive orders and do not give them. Heritage ran a perplexed hand through his hair. The sunset which had been flaming for some time in the unshuttered panes was now passing into the dark. The girl lit a lamp after first shuttering the rest of the windows. As she turned it up the odd dusty room and its strange company were revealed more clearly and Dickson saw with a shock how haggard was the beautiful face. A great pity seized him and almost conquered his timidity. It is very difficult to help you, Heritage was saying. You won't leave this place, and you won't claim the protection of the law. You are very independent, mademoiselle, but it can't go on forever. The man you fear may arrive at any moment. At any moment, too, your treasure may be discovered. It is that weighs on me, she cried. The jewels. They are my solemn trust, but they burden me terribly. If I were only rid of them and knew them to be safe I should face the rest with a braver mind. If you'll take my advice, said Dickson slowly, you'll get them deposited in a bank and take a receipt for them. A Scotch bank is no in a hurry to surrender a deposit without it gets the proper authority. Heritage brought his hands together with a smack. That's an idea. Will you trust us to take these things and deposit them safely? For a little she was silent and her eyes were fixed on each of the trio in turn. I will trust you, she said at last. I think you will not betray me. By God, we won't, said the poet fervently. Dogson, it's up to you. You march off to Glasgow in double quick time and place the stuff in your own name in your own bank. There's not a moment to lose. Do you hear? I will that. To his own surprise Dickson spoke without hesitation. Partly it was because of his merchant's sense of property, which made him hate the thought that miscreants should acquire that to which they had no title, but mainly it was the appeal in those haggard childish eyes. But I'm not going to be tramping the country in the night carrying a fortune and seeking for trains that aren't there. I'll go the first thing in the morning. Where are they? Heritage asked. That I do not tell. But I will fetch them. She left the room and presently returned with 3 odd little parcels wrapped in leather and tied with thongs of raw hide. She gave them to Heritage, who held them appraisingly in his hand and then passed them to Dickson. I do not ask about their contents. We take them from you as they are, and, please God, when the moment comes they will be returned to you as you gave them. You trust us, mademoiselle. I trust you, for you are a soldier. Oh, and I thank you from my heart, my friends. She held out a hand to each, which caused Heritage to grow suddenly very red. I will remain in the neighborhood to await developments, he said. We had better leave you now. Dougal, lead on. Before going, he took the girl's hand again, and with a sudden movement bent and kissed it. Dickson shook it heartily. Cheer up, ma'am, he observed. There's a better time coming. His last recollection of her eyes was of a soft mistiness not far from tears. His pouch and pipe had strange company jostling them in his pocket as he followed the others down the ladder into the night. Dougal insisted that they must return by the road of the morning. We daren't go by the lava, for that would bring us by the public house. If the worst comes to the worst, and we fall in any of the devils, they must think you've changed your mind and come back from Auchenlacan. The night smelt fresh and moist as if a break in the weather were imminent. As they scrambled along the Garpaldine, a pinprick of light below showed where the tinklers were busy by their fire. Dickson's spirit suffered a sharp fall and he began to marvel at his temerity. What in heaven's name had he undertaken? To carry very precious things, to which certainly he had no right, through the enemy to distant Glasgow. How could he escape the notice of the watchers? He was already suspect, and the sight of him back again in Doubtharter would double that suspicion. He must brazen it out, but he distrusted his powers with such tell-tale stuff in his pockets. They might murder him anywhere on the moor road or in an empty railway carriage. An unpleasant memory of various novels he had read in which such things happened haunted his mind. There was just one consolation. This job over, he would be quit of the whole business. And honorably quit, too, for he would have played a manly part in a most unpleasant affair. He could retire to the idyllic with the knowledge that he had not been wanting when romance called. Not a soul should ever hear of it, but he saw himself in the future tramping green roads or sitting by his winter fireside pleasantly retelling himself the tale. Before they came to the Garpal Bridge, Dougal insisted that they should separate, remarking that it would never do if we were seen together. Heritage was dispatched by a short cut over fields to the left, which eventually, after one or two plunges into ditches, landed him safely in Mrs. Moran's backyard. Dickson and Dougal crossed the bridge and tramped Doubtharter wards by the highway. There was no sign of human life in that quiet place, with owls hooting and rabbits rustling in the undergrowth. Beyond the woods they came in sight of the light in the back kitchen, and both seemed to relax their watchfulness when it was most needed. Dougal sniffed the air and looked seaward. It's coming on to rain, he observed. There should be a muckle star there, and when you can't see it, it means wet weather this wind. What star? Dickson asked. The one the Irish Lutkin name. What's that they call it? O'Brien? And he pointed to where the constellation of the Hunter should have been declining on the western horizon. There was a bend of the road behind them, and suddenly round it came a dogcart driven rapidly. Dougal slipped like a weasel into a bush, and presently Dickson stood revealed in the glare of a lamp. The horse was pulled up sharply and the driver called out to him. He saw that it was Dobson the innkeeper with Leon beside him. "Who is it?" cried the voice. "Oh, you. I thought you were off the day." Dickson rose nobly to the occasion. "I thought myself I was. But I didn't think much of Auchenlacan, and I took a fancy to come back and spend the last night of my holiday with my auntie. I'm off to Glasgow first thing the morn's morn." "So," said the voice. "Queer thing I never saw ye on the Auchenlacan road, where ye can see 3 mile before ye." "I left early and took it easy along the shore." "Did ye so? Well, good night to ye." 5 minutes later Dickson walked into Mrs. Moran's kitchen, where Heritage was busy making up for a day of short provender. "I'm for Glasgow tomorrow, Auntie Femi," he cried. "I want you to loan me a wee trunk with a key, and steek the doors and windows, for I've a lot to tell you."